It began with a commander who never sought the spotlight, and an army that carried the weight of the war, one hard mile at a time. Hodges' First Army did not arrive in Europe with a reputation for drama or daring headlines. It arrived with responsibility. From the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany, this army was asked again and again to do the grinding work that made everything else possible: break the line, hold the ground, absorb the counterattack, move forward anyway. The First Army was built for pressure. Its soldiers came ashore under fire, stepping into surf thick with smoke, confusion, and urgency. Beaches were only the beginning. Beyond them waited hedgerows that erased visibility, villages turned into fortresses, and roads that funneled movement into danger. Every advance required coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, and air support, and every mistake was paid for immediately. Omar Bradley's shadow loomed over the American ground war, but Courtney Hodges would command the largest American army group in the West at its most demanding moments. Quiet, reserved, and methodical, Hodges was not a showman. He was a manager of pressure, tasked with keeping a massive force moving through terrain and resistance that punished hesitation. Normandy tested the First Army first. Hedgerows turned fields into mazes. Progress slowed to yards. Losses mounted without dramatic breakthroughs. The army learned, adapted, and pushed forward anyway. When the breakout finally came, the First Army surged east, exploiting openings with speed that felt almost unreal after weeks of attrition. But speed never lasted long. Rivers followed, cities followed. Resistance hardened again. Then came the forest. The Hürtgen Forest swallowed units whole. Dense trees blocked artillery observation. Rain and mud turned trails into traps. Explosions splintered trees into lethal fragments. The First Army was ordered forward into ground that resisted every step, not for glory, but because holding that terrain mattered to everything that came next. The cost was enormous. The gains were painfully slow. The army endured. Winter brought no relief. When the German Ardennes Offensive erupted, the First Army stood directly in its path. Thinly held sectors were hit with violence and surprise. Units were cut off. Roads were lost. Confusion spread. Hodges' headquarters itself was displaced as the front bent under pressure. Yet the army did not break. Instead, it absorbed the blow. Elements held where they could. Others delayed where holding was impossible. Time was bought in minutes and hours that became decisive days. As the offensive stalled and reversed, the First Army regrouped and pushed back, reclaiming ground through snow, forest, and ruined towns. The work was relentless. There were no easy advances. Every river crossing demanded engineers and sacrifice. Every city demanded street fighting, measured in exhaustion. By the time the First Army crossed into Germany, the war had become heavy and inevitable. Resistance continued. Losses continued. The responsibility did not lessen. The First Army cleared the Siegfried Line, crossed the Rhine, and advanced through terrain that no longer promised victory, only completion. When the Ruhr Pocket closed, it was First Army units that helped seal it, capturing vast numbers of enemy troops and collapsing organized resistance in the West. Throughout it all, Hodges remained what he had always been: understated, steady, and focused on keeping the army functioning under impossible strain. His leadership was not theatrical. It was connective. He coordinated forces spread across vast fronts, managed pressure from above and below, and carried the weight of decisions that affected hundreds of thousands of lives. The history of Hodges' First Army is not a story of a single moment. It is a story of accumulation, of effort layered upon effort, of an army that was always present when the fighting was hardest. It shows how wars are actually won, not just by bold moves, but by endurance, logistics, coordination, and the willingness to keep moving when the cost is already high. Tonight, we return to that long road, from the beaches to the hedgerows, from forests to frozen counteroffensives, from river crossings to final collapse, to the army that carried the center of the Western War on its shoulders. Before we continue, I want to bring you into this moment as well. Where in the world are you listening from right now, and what time has settled around you there? Is it late into the night, early morning, or that quiet space where the day finally lets go? If listening to these long, steady journeys through the backbone of history helps you slow down, stay focused, or unwind without noise or rush, consider subscribing, not for highlights, but for the continuity of thoughtful stories that move at the pace the past actually did. Settle in. This is Hodges First Army, and its war was never easy, never quiet, and never finished quickly. June 6th, 1945. Victory in Europe had been declared just 1 month earlier. Across America, ticker-tape parades celebrated returning heroes. Newspapers splashed photographs of General George Patton, arms raised in triumph. Magazines ran cover stories on Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's tactical genius. Newsreels showed General Dwight Eisenhower accepting Germany's surrender, flanked by smiling commanders whose names every schoolchild knew. But in the crowd of celebrating generals, one face was conspicuously absent. The commander of the largest American combat force in European history, an army of more than 400,000 men, had simply vanished from the narrative. His name appeared in no headlines. His photograph graced no magazine covers. And standing in his modest Georgia home that June morning, Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges watched the celebrations on newsreels with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had just pulled off the greatest disappearing act of the Second World War. The erasure had been so complete that even war correspondents who'd spent months embedded with American forces struggled to explain what had happened. Ernie Pyle, America's most famous combat journalist, had written a column in July 1944 titled simply, "Where is First Army?" The piece never ran. Military censors killed it before publication, citing operational security. But the Normandy invasion was already 6 weeks old. Security couldn't explain why the army that had stormed Omaha Beach, that was grinding through the hedgerows of France, that would ultimately advance 800 miles from the English Channel to the Elbe River, had become a ghost in its own story. Other correspondents noticed the pattern. References to First Army disappeared from their dispatches, replaced with vague phrases like Allied forces or American units. By August, when the breakout from Normandy finally came, the censorship had become so systematic that reporters simply stopped trying. They wrote about Patton's Third Army instead. At least those stories made it past the censors. The numbers told a different story than the headlines suggested. First Army had been activated as an operational headquarters on October 20th, 1943, at Bristol, England. By D-Day, it controlled 5 divisions and more than 70,000 combat troops. By August 1944, it had swelled to 15 divisions and over 300,000 soldiers. At its peak strength in March 1945, First Army fielded 4 corps, 9 divisions, and 412,000 men, the largest American field army ever committed to battle in Europe. For comparison, Patton's vaunted Third Army never exceeded 350,000 men. Montgomery's entire 21st Army Group, comprising all British and Canadian forces in Northwest Europe, peaked at around 500,000. Yet, if you picked up any major American newspaper between June 1944 and May 1945, you'd read about Patton's exploits in obsessive detail while First Army appeared, if at all, as a footnote. The disconnect between importance and recognition was so extreme that it demanded explanation. Armies don't become invisible by accident. The geographic scope of First Army's operations reads like a catalog of the European war's most critical battles. First Army troops waded ashore on Omaha Beach and Utah Beach on June 6, 1944. They fought the meat grinder of the Norman hedgerows through June and July. They executed Operation Cobra, the breakout that shattered German defenses in France. They liberated Paris in late August, attached the French 2nd Armored Division to American forces for the ceremonial entry. They reached the German border by September, fought the brutal house-to-house combat for Aachen, the first German city to fall. They bled through the Hürtgen Forest from September to December, losing 33,000 men for 50 square miles of worthless timber. They bore the brunt of Hitler's Ardennes Offensive in December, the attack Americans called the Battle of the Bulge. They captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen in March 1945, the only intact crossing of the Rhine River. They encircled and destroyed the German Army Group B in the Ruhr Pocket, accepting the surrender of 325,000 enemy soldiers, and they reached the Elbe River in late April. stopping just 69 miles from Berlin only because political agreements with Stalin forbade them from going further. This was not a secondary force. This was the spearhead. The casualty figures reinforce First Army's central role. Between D-Day and VE Day, 343 consecutive days of combat operations, First Army suffered approximately 190,000 casualties. Of these, roughly 40,000 were killed in action. Another 115,000 were wounded, and the remainder were listed as missing or captured. These numbers represented nearly 45% of all American ground combat casualties in the European theater. First Army divisions rotated men through the line continuously, with some rifle companies experiencing 300% turnover rates, meaning the average company was completely replaced 3 times between Normandy and Germany. The 1st Infantry Division, known as the Big Red One, suffered over 21,000 casualties during its time with First Army. The 4th Infantry Division, which landed on Utah Beach and fought all the way to the Czech border, lost over 23,000 men. These weren't abstract statistics. They were farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit, teachers from Oregon, and mechanics from Alabama, bleeding into French hedgerows and German forests while the press corps celebrated someone else's victories 300 miles away. The suppression became so blatant that it triggered quiet rebellion among military public affairs officers. Captain Harold Denny, a former New York Times reporter serving as a First Army press liaison, kept a private diary documenting the censorship. His entries from July and August 1944 record his mounting frustration. Killed another story mentioning First Army by name. He wrote on July 15th, "Orders from Schaeff, no explanation given." On August 3rd, correspondents openly asking why they can't write about the army that's actually doing the fighting. I have no answer to give them. By August 22nd, after Paris fell, we've been instructed to credit American forces for the liberation. French 2nd Armored gets named, 4th Infantry Division gets named. First Army, which commanded both, does not. This is deliberate policy. Denny's diary, declassified in 1978, provides documentary evidence that the erasure came from the top. SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Eisenhower's command, was actively suppressing First Army's identity in the historical record as events unfolded. The British press noticed what the American press had been ordered to ignore. The Times of London ran a perceptive editorial on August 19, 1944, titled "The Anonymous Army." The piece noted that while American newspapers breathlessly reported Patton's advances, a far larger American force under General Courtney Hodges has been fighting with equal distinction and appears to have been airbrushed from existence by Allied censors. The editorial speculated that political sensitivities regarding Field Marshal Montgomery might explain the suppression, a diplomatic way of suggesting that acknowledging First Army's accomplishments might highlight British failures by comparison. The editorial concluded, "One day, historians will puzzle over how the largest American army in Europe became the Invisible Army. The soldiers who fought in its ranks deserve better than this organized forgetting." The American Office of War Information immediately protested to the British Ministry of Information. The Times received a strongly worded request to avoid speculation about Allied command arrangements. The paper ran no further editorials about First Army. Even the official U.S. Army histories, compiled in the years after the war, struggled with how to present First Army's role. The U.S. Army's Center of Military History published its Green Book series, multi-volume official histories of American operations, between 1947 and 1993. These volumes acknowledge First Army's existence but devote disproportionate attention to other forces. The volume covering the breakout from Normandy spends 3 chapters on Patton's exploitation and less than 1 chapter on First Army's Operation Cobra, despite Cobra being the attack that made Patton's advance possible. The volume on the Battle of the Bulge focuses heavily on isolated units like the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, which was surrounded and eventually relieved by Patton's Third Army, while giving relatively brief coverage to First Army's actual halting and reversal of the German offensive. The official historians had access to all classified records. They knew the full story. But The narrative framework established in wartime press coverage had become set in institutional concrete. For the men who served in First Army, the historical amnesia stung. Sergeant Frank Towers of the 1st Infantry Division kept every newspaper clipping about the war he could find during his service. After returning home to Michigan in 1945, he sorted through his collection and made a disturbing discovery. Of 67 articles he'd saved about the European campaign, only 4 mentioned First Army by name. 52 mentioned Patton or Third Army. "We used to joke that we were fighting a secret war," Towers recalled in a 1988 oral history interview. "But it stopped being funny when we realized nobody back home had any idea what we'd done. My own father asked me why I hadn't served with Patton. I told him I'd landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day. He said, 'That was Patton, wasn't it?' I didn't have the heart to correct him. What was the point?" The history books were going to say whatever they were going to say. Towers died in 1996, still bitter that his division's sacrifices had been systematically written out of the war's popular narrative. The invisibility of First Army created one of the Second World War's most glaring historical paradoxes. The largest American combat force in Europe, commanded continuously for 11 months of combat, fighting from Normandy to the Elbe, suffering the highest casualties, capturing the most prisoners, achieving the war's most critical breakthrough at Cobra, and its most opportune exploitation at Remagen, somehow became less famous than a smaller army that entered combat 2 months later. This wasn't an accident of historical memory. This wasn't the random drift of public attention. This was engineered erasure, executed in real time, for reasons that would only become clear when examining the political calculations that governed Allied command relationships. Understanding why First Army disappeared requires understanding what it accomplished, who led it, how it fought, and why powerful figures needed its achievements hidden. The Invisible Army had a story. That story begins not with battles or invasions, but with an unlikely man who would prove perfect for a command that demanded brilliance without glory. His name was Courtney Hodges, and his path to leading 400,000 men started with spectacular failure. June 10th, 1904. A young cadet stood at attention in the commandant's office at the United States Military Academy, West Point, New York. Courtney Hicks Hodges, 19 years old, had just received the news every cadet dreaded. He had failed his mathematics examination for the 2nd consecutive semester. Under Academy regulations, 2 failures meant automatic dismissal. There would be no appeal, no second chance, no redemption. Hodges' father had used political connections to secure the appointment to West Point. The family had celebrated when the acceptance letter arrived. Now, just 1 year later, Courtney would return to Perry, Georgia in disgrace, a failure before his adult life had even begun. As he walked out of the administration building that June afternoon, carrying his few possessions in a single trunk, Hodges had no way of knowing he'd just taken the first step toward becoming one of only 2 men in American history to command an army in combat without a West Point diploma. The other was Ulysses S. Grant, and Grant at least had graduated before resigning his commission. Hodges hadn't made it past freshman year. The failure at West Point might have ended a military career before it started, but Hodges possessed something that transcended academic credentials: pure stubbornness. Rather than returning to Georgia to face his family's disappointment, he made an extraordinary decision. On September the 1st, 1906, 2 years and 3 months after his West Point dismissal, Hodges enlisted as a private in the 17th Infantry Regiment at Fort McPherson, Georgia. He was 21 years old, starting at the absolute bottom of the military hierarchy. Most failed cadets would have pursued civilian careers, their military ambitions abandoned. Hodges instead chose to prove his worth the hardest way possible: from the ranks. The decision revealed something fundamental about his character. He wasn't interested in shortcuts or second chances through political influence. If he couldn't become an officer through the academy's front door, he'd earn a commission through demonstrated competence in the field. It would take him 4 years of service as an enlisted man, but on June 29, 1910, Private Hodges became Second Lieutenant Hodges through battlefield commission. He'd done it without West Point's credentials or its social connections. He'd simply outworked everyone around him. The young officer's early career provided little hint of the heights he'd eventually reach. Hodges served with the 17th Infantry through the Mexican Punitive Expedition of 1916 and 1917, chasing Pancho Villa through the deserts of northern Mexico. He commanded a machine gun platoon, learned Spanish, and acquired the stoic patience of a professional soldier doing unglamorous work in difficult conditions. When America entered World War I in April 1917, Captain Hodges deployed to France with the 6th Infantry Regiment, 5th Division. The division arrived too late for the war's early battles, but reached France in time for the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, the largest American operation of the war. On October 16, 1918, Hodges led his company in an assault on a German strongpoint called Côte de Châtillon, a fortified hill north of Verdun. The position commanded the entire valley. Taking it required climbing exposed slopes under interlocking machine gun fire. Hodges led the assault personally. The fight for Côte de Châtillon showcased the kind of infantry leader Hodges had become. As his company climbed the slope, German machine guns opened fire from concealed positions. Men dropped all around him, their bodies tumbling back down the hill. Hodges kept advancing, moving from crater to crater, directing his remaining troops with hand signals because verbal commands couldn't be heard over the gunfire. He spotted the nearest machine gun nest, 3 German soldiers traversing fire across the slope. Rather than waiting for supporting fire, Hodges pulled his pistol and rushed the position alone, covering the last 30 yards in a zigzagging sprint while bullets kicked up dirt around his boots. He killed the machine gunner at point-blank range, shot the 2nd German as the man tried to swing the weapon around, and forced the 3rd to surrender. With the 1st gun silenced, Hodges reorganized his scattered company and led them to the summit. American forces captured Côte de Châtillon by nightfall. Hodges earned the Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's 2nd highest decoration for valor, for his actions that day. More importantly, he demonstrated a fundamental principle he'd carry through his entire career: lead from the front, solve problems directly, let results speak louder than words. The interwar years saw Hodges develop into the Army's archetypal professional infantryman. He attended the infantry school at Fort Benning, Georgia, where he studied tactics under Colonel George Marshall, the future Army Chief of Staff. Marshall recognized Hodges' quiet competence and marked him as a future leader in his private efficiency reports. Captain Hodges lacks the personality for high command, Marshall wrote in 1924, but possesses the tactical judgment and moral courage that makes for excellent execution of orders. He would make a superb corps commander. The assessment proved prophetic, though Marshall's early doubt about Hodges' suitability for high command reflected a common misreading of the man's character. Hodges' soft-spoken manner, reluctance to self-promote, and preference for letting his work speak for itself made him appear too passive for senior leadership in an army that valued aggressive personalities. But those who knew him best understood that Hodges' quietness masked absolute professional confidence. He didn't need to promote himself because he knew his competence would be recognized by anyone whose opinion mattered. By 1941, Hodges had risen to brigadier general and assumed command of the infantry school at Fort Benning, the same institution where he'd once been a student. His tenure there proved transformative for the expanding army. As war approached, the infantry school became the factory that produced the junior officers who would lead America's ground forces. Hodges modernized the curriculum, emphasizing combined arms coordination, how infantry, artillery, armor, and air power could work together rather than as separate services. He pushed for realistic training that stressed decision-making under pressure. "We can teach a man to shoot in weeks," he told his instructors. "We can teach him to think under fire only by creating conditions where he must think under fire. Make the training harder than combat." The graduation rates dropped as standards rose, but the quality of officers commissioned from Benning improved dramatically. When those lieutenants and captains reached Normandy 3 years later, they'd be leading companies and battalions in exactly the kind of close quarters, combined arms fighting Hodges had trained them for. In March 1941, Chief of Staff George Marshall, the same officer who'd assessed Hodges nearly 2 decades earlier, appointed him Chief of Infantry, making him responsible for all infantry training, doctrine, and equipment across the entire Army. Hodges immediately set about fixing what he saw as the infantry's most critical deficiency. its lack of organic firepower. American infantry divisions in 1941 still relied on bolt-action Springfield rifles as their primary weapon. Hodges pushed for universal adoption of the M1 Garand, the semi-automatic rifle that gave American infantrymen 8 shots without reloading. He advocated for more machine guns per company, more mortars per battalion, and more artillery per division. His guiding principle was simple. The infantry would always be asked to attack prepared positions defended by determined enemies. That kind of fighting required overwhelming firepower to suppress defenders, while riflemen closed to assault range. When critics argued that more automatic weapons would waste ammunition, Hodges replied, "We'll waste less ammunition than we'll waste lives. I'd rather supply a division with 10,000 extra rounds than explain to 10 mothers why their sons died with empty rifles." The promotion to 3-star general came in March 1943, when Marshall appointed Hodges commander of 3rd Army at Fort Sam Houston, Texas. The assignment carried enormous responsibility. 3rd Army would be one of America's primary field armies in the coming invasion of Europe. Its commander would need to train divisions, build staff procedures, and prepare hundreds of thousands of men for combat. But in January 1944, Eisenhower made a fateful decision. He selected George Patton to command 3rd Army, shifting Hodges to a different role. Patton was returning from North Africa and Sicily, where his aggressive personality and controversial actions, including slapping shell-shock soldiers, had made him both celebrated and controversial. Eisenhower needed Patton's aggressive spirit, but worried about his judgment. The solution was elegant. Assign Patton to an army that wouldn't enter combat until after the beachhead was secure, giving him limited opportunities for independent action. That meant Eisenhower needed someone else to command the army that would actually storm the beaches and break out of Normandy. He needed someone tactically sound, absolutely reliable, and comfortable operating under close supervision. He chose Hodges. On February 1st, 1944, Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges assumed duties as Deputy Commander, 1st United States Army, stationed in Bristol, England. The formal commander was Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, but Bradley's role was temporary. Everyone understood that Bradley would assume command of 12th Army Group once enough American forces reached France to require an Army Group headquarters. When that happened, Hodges would inherit 1st Army. It was the most critical combat command in the American Army, the force that would execute the D-Day landings and lead the drive across France. Yet the appointment generated almost no public attention. While newspapers speculated endlessly about when Patton would return to action, Hodges' selection received brief mention in the back pages. One Associated Press article from February 6th ran just 3 paragraphs. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges has been named Deputy Commander of 1st Army in England. General Hodges previously served as Chief of Infantry. He is known for his expertise in infantry tactics. The article misspelled his first name as Courtney, a mistake that would plague him throughout the war. The American public had no idea who he was. After VE Day, most still wouldn't. It was perfect casting for the Invisible Army. Hodges brought to 1st Army the accumulated wisdom of 38 years of military service. He'd experienced military life as an enlisted soldier, giving him insights that academy graduates often lacked. He'd earned his commission through performance rather than credentials, making him sensitive to merit-based promotion throughout his command. He'd led infantry in combat, teaching him the costs of bad tactics measured in dead soldiers. He'd served as Chief of Infantry during the Army's expansion, understanding training and logistics at systemic levels. And he'd developed a command philosophy centered on thorough preparation, decentralized execution, and accountability for results. Unlike Patton, who cultivated a flamboyant public persona and led through force of personality, Hodges built systems that functioned even when he wasn't personally present. Unlike Montgomery, who insisted on controlling every detail from headquarters, Hodges gave subordinate commanders clear objectives and trusted them to determine methods. His style was professional craftsman rather than charismatic warrior. He would never inspire the devotion that Patton commanded, or the confidence that Eisenhower projected. But he would build an army that functioned like a precision machine, grinding through opposition with methodical efficiency, winning through coordination and persistence rather than brilliance or luck. The man who would command 400,000 soldiers in 11 months of continuous combat remained largely unknown, even to many of his own troops. Hodges rarely visited frontline units during combat. He believed his place was at headquarters, coordinating operations rather than providing morale inspiration. He gave few press interviews and declined most requests for profiles. He kept no diary and wrote no memoir after the war, leaving historians with limited personal sources. His staff officers described him as courteous, detail-oriented, and occasionally inflexible. His corps commanders praised his clear orders and consistent support. His soldiers barely knew his name. And that anonymity, that willful invisibility, would define both his greatest strength and his historical curse. Courtney Hodges was the perfect commander for an army that would be hidden from history, a leader whose brilliance lay in building systems rather than attracting attention. The question was whether those systems would hold when tested by German resistance, logistical nightmares, and the brutal reality of sustained ground combat. The answer would come on the beaches of Normandy, where First Army would face its first test. The preparation for that test consumed the spring of 1944, as Hodges and his staff transformed strategic plans into operational orders that would, if successful, crack open Hitler's fortress Europe. The machine was being built. Soon, it would face its trial by fire. January 15, 1944. In a requisitioned country estate outside Bristol, England, 43 staff officers of 1st United States Army gathered around a 30-foot table covered with maps. Rain hammered the windows. The men wore heavy wool uniforms against the damp cold that penetrated even heated British buildings. At the head of the table, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley stood beside a map of the Norman coast, showing every beach, every bluff, every road and village from Cherbourg to Caen. This was the first full staff briefing on Operation Overlord, the invasion of France, and the officers present would spend the next 5 months translating strategic vision into executable orders. The challenge was unprecedented in military history. No army had ever attempted an amphibious assault of this scale. The Allied landings in North Africa in 1942 had involved smaller forces hitting lightly defended beaches. Sicily in 1943 had been chaotic despite weak opposition. Normandy would be different. First Army would land 5 divisions, roughly 50,000 combat troops, on hostile beaches defended by German forces expecting the invasion. Everything that could go wrong probably would go wrong. The staff's job was to plan for every contingency they could imagine and build enough flexibility into the system to handle the ones they couldn't. The operational requirements were staggering. First Army needed to land not just soldiers, but entire divisions with all their equipment, supplies, and supporting arms. A single American infantry division in 1944 numbered approximately 14,000 men, organized into 3 infantry regiments, 4 artillery battalions, and various support units including engineers, medical, signal, and quartermaster companies. Each division required roughly 400 vehicles, jeeps, trucks, half-tracks, plus its own artillery pieces, anti-tank guns, and supplies for sustained operations. Multiply that by 5 divisions landing in the first 24 hours, then factor in additional corps-level units, and the logistics became almost incomprehensible. First Army planners calculated they'd need to land approximately 3,000 vehicles and 1,500 tons of supplies on D-Day alone. This didn't include the tanks, tank destroyers, and specialized engineering equipment required to break through beach defenses. All of this equipment would have to cross open beaches under fire, then move inland through terrain that intelligence suggested would be extremely difficult for vehicles. The English Channel wasn't just a water barrier. It was a logistics nightmare that would persist even after troops secured the beachhead. Major General Leonard Jarrow commanded V Corps, which would assault Omaha Beach, the most critical and most difficult of First Army's 2 landing zones. Jarrow was 55 years old, a meticulous planner who'd served in the Army War Plans Division before the war. He understood the strategic imperatives. Omaha Beach lay directly north of the critical road junction at St. Lo, which in turn controlled access to the Cotentin Peninsula and the port of Cherbourg. Without Cherbourg, the Allies couldn't sustain a major force in France. The shallow draft artificial harbors called mulberries would support initial operations, but couldn't handle long-term supply needs. That meant V Corps absolutely had to take Omaha, establish a lodgment, and push inland to link with British forces attacking to the east. Hedgerows spent weeks walking the intelligence models First Army had constructed based on aerial reconnaissance photographs. The models showed Omaha's geography in miniature, 4 miles of beach overlooked by 100-foot bluffs, with only 5 exit points where roads cut through to the interior. German defenses included concrete bunkers, artillery positions, minefields, and beach obstacles designed to destroy landing craft before they even reached shore. "Omaha's not a beach," Hedgerows told his operations officer in February. "It's a killing ground. We're going to take horrific casualties in the first 2 hours. The question is whether we can push through fast enough to keep moving before the Germans reinforce." Major General J. Lawton Collins commanded 7th Corps, tasked with Utah Beach on the western end of First Army's sector. Collins, just 47 years old, had earned the nickname Lightning Joe for his aggressive tactics commanding the 25th Infantry Division on Guadalcanal. Where Hedgerows was cautious and methodical, Collins was bold and improvisational. His personality suited Utah Beach's mission. 7th Corps would land in the shadow of the Cottontan Peninsula, then drive north to capture Cherbourg, an objective that required speed and audacity more than careful coordination. Collins studied the terrain obsessively, noting that Utah Beach sat behind extensive coastal flooding that German engineers had created by damming local rivers. The flooding channeled American forces into predictable routes, making them vulnerable to artillery fire. Collins' solution was characteristically aggressive. Drop 2 entire airborne divisions, the 82nd and 101st, behind the beaches before dawn, have them secure the causeways through the flooded zones, and use them to disrupt German reinforcements. It was risky. Airborne operations were notoriously unpredictable, with units often landing miles from intended drop zones. But Collins argued that even scattered paratroopers would create chaos behind German lines. "I don't need the airborne to capture objectives," he said. "I need them to make the Germans worry about their rear while we hit their front. Chaos is a weapon." The artillery problem consumed weeks of staff planning. American artillery doctrine in 1944 emphasized massed fires, concentrating multiple battalions on single targets to achieve overwhelming local superiority. But Omaha and Utah Beaches would be divided by geography, with V Corps and 7th Corps separated by the Vire River estuary. Coordinating fires across that gap would be difficult. First Army's artillery chief, Brigadier General Charles Hart, proposed a solution that had never been attempted in American military history: time on target, shortened to TOT. The concept was elegant. Rather than having multiple artillery battalions fire sequential vollages that gave defenders time to take cover, TOT coordinated all participating batteries to fire at different times, such that their shells arrive simultaneously. A battalion 10 miles from the target would fire first. A battalion 5 miles away would fire later. All rounds would impact within a 5-second window, giving defenders no warning and no chance to seek shelter. Hart calculated that a properly coordinated TOT could put 200 rounds on a single target in 5 seconds, the equivalent destructive power of a World War I barrage compressed into a single overwhelming pulse. The technique required precise timing, perfect communication, and extensive pre-planning to calculate firing tables for different distances. First Army spent March and April building the systems to make it work. By May, American artillery could execute TOT missions against any pre-registered target in the beachhead. It would prove one of First Army's decisive technical advantages. The air-ground coordination challenge proved even more complex than artillery. In 1944, the Army Air Force operated largely independently from ground forces. Strategic bombers attacked German industry and infrastructure based on targeting lists developed by Air Force planners. Medium bombers and fighter bombers conducted interdiction missions, hitting railroads, bridges, and supply columns to isolate the battlefield. But First Army needed something different: tactical air support directly responsive to ground commanders' requests, able to attack enemy positions that artillery couldn't reach, and mobile enough to shift targets as the battle developed. the 9th Air Force, assigned to support First Army, had experimented with air-ground liaison teams in North Africa and Italy, but never at the scale Overlord would require. Brigadier General Elwood Quesada, commanding 9th Air Force's Nimi Tactical Air Command, worked directly with First Army staff to solve the problem. They created forward air controllers, Air Force officers attached to each division and corps headquarters, equipped with radios that could communicate directly with aircraft overhead. These controllers would ride in Sherman tanks specially modified with powerful radio sets, allowing them to stay close to frontline combat units. When ground commanders needed air support, they'd request it through the controller, who'd coordinate with aircraft already airborne in assigned sectors. Quesada promised First Army he could deliver bombs on target within 15 minutes of request. The system had never been tested in combat. It would either revolutionize tactical warfare or collapse into chaos. April 28, 1944. Exercise. Tiger was the final full-scale rehearsal for Utah Beach, conducted at Slapton Sands on England's southwest coast. The beach there resembled Utah's geography. Long stretches of sand backed by low bluffs, suitable for practicing amphibious assault techniques. First Army loaded 30,000 men aboard landing ships and conducted a mock assault complete with live ammunition, fired overhead to accustom troops to the noise and confusion of combat. The exercise began in early morning darkness, just as D-Day would. Landing craft circled offshore, waiting for the signal to head for the beach. Then, everything went wrong. German E-boats, fast attack craft armed with torpedoes, had slipped through the British destroyer screen, protecting the exercise. At 0200 hours, the E-boats attacked the line of LSTs, landing ship, tank, carrying vehicles and supplies. 2 LSTs were hit and sank in minutes. Men in full combat gear jumped into 50-degree water and drowned before rescue boats could reach them. Explosions lit the night sky. Troops already ashore heard the detonations and saw the flames, creating panic about whether this was exercise or actual German attack. When dawn came and the casualties were counted, 749 American soldiers were dead. Most had drowned. Some had been killed by torpedo explosions. A few had been shot by their own men in the confusion. It was the deadliest training accident of the war. Eisenhower ordered the entire disaster classified. Families received telegrams saying their sons had died in training, with no details provided. First Army learned crucial lessons from the deaths. Life vests needed to be worn properly, rescue procedures needed to be faster, security needed to be tighter. But publicly, Exercise Tiger never happened. The 749 men were among the war's first invisible casualties. By late May, First Army had assembled in southern England a force that dwarfed anything America had previously deployed. V Corps and 7 Corps together comprised 5 infantry divisions, the 1st and 29th for Omaha Beach, the 4th for Utah Beach, and the 2nd and 90th in immediate reserve. Supporting them were 2 armored divisions, 3 armored brigades, multiple tank destroyer battalions, 21 artillery battalions, 15 engineer battalions, and extensive service support units. The total force numbered approximately 130,000 soldiers, 3,000 tanks and vehicles, and enough ammunition for 30 days of sustained combat. All of this had to be loaded aboard ships in precise sequence. Supplies needed first had to load last so they could be unloaded first, and staged in ports from Plymouth to Portsmouth. The logistics officers called it combat loading, and it required mathematical precision. Load a ship wrong, and critical supplies stayed trapped below decks while fighting raged above. Load the ships in wrong sequence, and the entire invasion timetable collapsed. Major General Charles Thrasher, First Army's G4, Chief Logistics Officer, worked 18-hour days through May, personally reviewing loading plans for every transport. He developed stomach ulcers from stress and lost 20 pounds. But when D-Day came, every First Army unit would have its essential supplies available when needed. The human dimension got less attention than logistics, but mattered just as much. The men boarding ships in early June 1944 ranged from veterans of North Africa and Sicily to new replacements who'd never heard shots fired in anger. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, had fought in North Africa, Sicily, and now Normandy, 3 amphibious assaults in 18 months. These men knew what to expect. Their officers were experienced, their NCOs were hardened, and their collective knowledge of how to survive combat gave them enormous advantages. But the 29th Infantry Division, assigned the most difficult sector of Omaha Beach, had never been in combat. Formed from National Guard units primarily from Virginia and Maryland, the 29th had trained for nearly 2 years, but lacked the combat wisdom that kept soldiers alive. First Army tried to compensate by attaching experienced officers from other divisions, but there was no substitute for having been shot at. On the transport ships crossing the Channel, men from the 1st Division quietly gave advice to their 29th Division counterparts. Keep your head down. Follow the sergeants, they know what they're doing. Don't bunch up on the beach. Move fast. Don't stop to help wounded until you're in cover. Simple lessons learned in blood that might keep some of these new soldiers alive long enough to learn their own lessons. June 5th, 1944. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges boarded the USS Attrition, a command ship equipped with extensive radio and communications equipment. Bradley had already moved to USS Augusta, the cruiser from which he'd direct the overall assault. That meant Hodges, as Deputy 1st Army Commander, would coordinate operations from Aachen, while Bradley provided strategic direction. The command ship carried 1,400 1st Army staff officers, operations planners, intelligence officers, communications specialists, logistics coordinators, all the expertise needed to run a field army during combat. Below decks, 17 tons of maps, charts, and written orders filled secure storage areas. The communications room housed 30 radio sets capable of reaching every unit from Corps headquarters down to regiment. Message traffic projections suggested 1st Army would send and receive over 5,000 messages in the first 24 hours of the invasion. Every one of those messages would flow through this ship. As Attrition pulled away from Portsmouth Harbor, Hodges stood on deck watching the coast recede. Around him stretched the largest armada in human history. 5,000 ships carrying 156,000 Allied soldiers toward Hitler's Atlantic Wall. 1st Army represented half that force. In approximately 12 hours, they would learn whether 2 years of planning and 6 months of preparation had been enough. Hodges had no illusions. Even perfect planning couldn't eliminate the friction of combat. Men would die because of mistakes no one could foresee. Equipment would fail at critical moments. The enemy would do things no one anticipated, but 1st Army had built systems designed to bend rather than break, to adapt rather than collapse. The machine was ready. Now came the test. June 6th, 1944, 0600 hours. The first landing craft carrying men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions hit the water 4,000 yards offshore from Omaha Beach. The boats wallowed in 6-foot swells, heavily laden with 32 soldiers each plus their equipment. Men huddled against the steel sides, many already vomiting from seasickness and fear. The naval bombardment that was supposed to destroy German beach defenses thundered overhead. Shells from battleships and cruisers screaming toward the bluffs in a curtain of fire that had begun at 0550. The sound was overwhelming. A continuous rolling thunder that made speech impossible. Officers checked watches. H hour was 0630. 30 minutes to beach. The landing craft formed waves, each wave carrying roughly 2,000 men toward assigned sectors with names like Easy Red, Fox Green, and Dog White. Inside the boats, veteran sergeants from the 1st Division tried to keep men calm while silently running through their own mental checklists. New soldiers from the 29th Division gripped their rifles and prayed, their faces gray with nausea and terror. Nobody talked about what they'd do when the ramp dropped. There was no point. In 30 minutes, they'd find out if the plan would work or if they'd die on the beach. At 0629, the naval bombardment lifted. The sudden silence felt almost as shocking as the noise had been. Men could hear waves slapping against landing craft, engines straining, gulls crying overhead. Then they heard something worse. German artillery opening fire from positions on the bluffs that the naval bombardment had failed to destroy. Shells began landing in the water around the approaching craft, sending up geysers of water and shrapnel. The German defenders had held their fire during the bombardment, hiding in deep bunkers designed to withstand naval gunfire. Now, as American landing craft closed to 1,000 yards, German machine guns and artillery emerged from cover. The Atlantic Wall at Omaha consisted of 15 strong points mounting 85 machine guns, 35 artillery pieces, and multiple mortar positions, all positioned to create interlocking fields of fire across the entire 4-mile beach. German gunners had pre-registered every grid square. They'd practiced for months, and they could see every landing craft approaching through the pre-dawn light. This wasn't going to be like North Africa or Sicily, where German defenses had been thinly spread and poorly coordinated. This was going to be industrial-scale slaughter. The disaster began at 0630 precisely. The first wave of landing craft hit the beach at 8 separate points. 6 of the 8 were in wrong locations, swept by current or confused by smoke, landing their troops anywhere from 400 to 1,000 yards from assigned objectives. This immediately destroyed unit cohesion. Companies that had planned to attack specific strongpoints found themselves scattered across unfamiliar terrain with no idea where supporting units were located. Worse, almost all the specialized equipment failed to arrive when needed. 29 amphibious Sherman tanks, modified to float with inflatable canvas skirts, were supposed to land ahead of infantry to provide covering fire. 27 sank in the rough seas, their crews drowning inside as water poured through torn canvas. The remaining 2 reached the beach, but were immediately knocked out by German anti-tank guns. The infantry waded ashore with no armor support whatsoever. Meanwhile, most of the engineer teams tasked with clearing beach obstacles never made it to their assigned sectors. Their landing craft were hit by artillery, or landed in wrong places, leaving 1,600 obstacles, steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes topped with mines, concrete tetrahedra, completely intact across the tidal zone. By 0700 hours, Omaha Beach had become a killing ground beyond even the most pessimistic predictions. The 29th Infantry Division's 116th Regiment, landing on the western end of Omaha at Dog Green and Dog Red sectors, experienced catastrophic casualties. Company A, 1st Battalion lost 96% of its strength in the first 20 minutes. 19 of its 200 men reached cover alive. The rest were killed or wounded, while still in waist-deep water or pinned on the exposed beach. Soldiers who weren't hit immediately threw themselves prone behind beach obstacles or against the shingle embankment at the high tide line, a 3-foot wall of stones that offered minimal protection. German machine gun fire methodically searched the beach from pre-positioned bunkers that naval gunfire hadn't touched. The Germans firing those guns belonged to the 352nd Infantry Division, a unit that wasn't supposed to be at Omaha at all according to Allied intelligence. The 352nd was conducting what they called a Kriegspiel, a readiness exercise, directly on the beach when the invasion began. Instead of the single understrength regiment First Army expected, Omaha was defended by a full-strength, well-trained division in hardened positions. The intelligence failure was catastrophic. At 0730 hours, aboard USS Attrition, 12 miles offshore, Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges received the first coherent report from V Corps about Omaha's situation. The message was brief and terrifying. Landings in doubt, obstacles intact, heavy casualties, troops pinned on beach, exits not taken. Request instructions. This was the nightmare scenario that had haunted planners for months. The entire assault force trapped on the beach, unable to advance, vulnerable to counterattack. Hodges immediately contacted V Corps Commander General Jarrow, asking for casualty estimates. Jarrow's response shocked even battle-hardened staff officers. Approximately 30% casualties in first hour, concentrated in rifle companies that had actually reached shore. Some companies had ceased to exist as fighting units. The chain of command was breaking down. Many company and battalion commanders were dead or wounded, leaving sergeants and junior officers making decisions without higher guidance. Naval observers watching through binoculars reported bodies floating in the surf, and wounded men drowning as the tide came in. One observer's written report, declassified in 1974, described what he saw in clinical language that barely masked horror. Beach appears covered with casualties, no movement visible, subsequent waves circling offshore, unable to land due to obstacles and fire. Hodges faced the most critical decision of his career. He had two choices, both terrible. First option, continue reinforcing Omaha, committing additional waves of troops to a beach where men were dying faster than they could fight back, gambling that sheer numbers would eventually overwhelm German defenses. This risked turning Omaha into a catastrophic failure that might collapse the entire invasion. Second option, divert follow-on waves to Utah Beach, where 7th Corps was having more success, effectively abandoning Omaha and accepting that First Army would operate from a single beachhead instead of two. This was safer, but meant giving up the road junction at St. Lo and direct access to Cherbourg. It might make the entire campaign slower and more costly. Hodges considered for less than 5 minutes. "Continue landing at Omaha," he ordered. "Commit 2nd Infantry Division if necessary. We hold what we take." It was a brutal calculation. More men would die. But losing Omaha meant operational failure that would haunt the campaign for months. The machine Hodges had built was designed to take losses and continue functioning. Now came the test of whether that design philosophy could survive its first encounter with reality. At 0800 hours, American destroyers made the decision that saved Omaha Beach. With troops pinned down and unable to advance, destroyer captains violated standing orders and brought their ships directly toward the beach, some closing to within 800 yards of shore, so close they risked grounding on sandbars. The destroyers USS Carmick, USS McCook, USS Satterlee, and 5 others began engaging German strongpoints with direct fire from their 5-inch guns. Unlike the earlier naval bombardment from heavy cruisers and battleships firing from miles offshore, the destroyers could see their targets through optical sights. They spotted German bunkers by muzzle flashes, adjusted fire by watching where shells hit, and walked their fire directly onto German positions. The Germans, who'd survived the earlier bombardment in deep shelters, found themselves facing plunging fire at almost point-blank range from ships that wouldn't miss. Bunkers that had seemed invulnerable collapsed under repeated hits. Machine gun positions disappeared in explosions of concrete and steel. The destroyer fire didn't stop German resistance, but it suppressed it enough that American soldiers could finally move. Between 0830 and 0900, small groups of men, 20 to 50 soldiers who'd found each other in the chaos, began infiltrating up the bluffs between German strongpoints. These improvised assault groups represented the breakdown of First Army's carefully structured plan, but they also showed the effectiveness of its training philosophy. When the formal command structure collapsed, when officers were dead, communications lost, and units scattered, individual soldiers defaulted to the basic skills they'd learned at Fort Benning and Camp AP Hill, and all the other training bases where Hodges had insisted on realistic preparation. They knew how to move under fire. They knew how to spot enemy positions. They knew how to work with whoever was nearby, regardless of unit assignment. A sergeant from the 29th Division might be leading riflemen from 3 different companies of the 1st Division, accompanied by a couple of engineers and a medic, attacking a German position they'd never seen before. No radios, no artillery support, no coordination with adjacent units. Just basic infantry skills applied by trained men under nightmare conditions. These small groups began clawing their way up the bluffs. By 1000 hours, the first Americans reached the top in several places. German defenders, seeing Americans behind them, began to panic. The interlocking fields of fire that made Omaha so deadly required defenders at each strongpoint, trusting that their flanks were secure. Once Americans got behind the coastal defenses, that trust evaporated. By 1300 hours, 7 hours after the first landing craft hit the beach, First Army had secured a foothold at Omaha that was exactly nothing like the plan, but sufficient to continue operations. Instead of the planned 3-mile deep lodgment with all 5 beach exits cleared and armor moving inland, V Corps held a ragged perimeter that extended barely 1 mile inland at its deepest point. 2 beach exits were partially open. German resistance continued from bypass strong points. Casualties were staggering. Approximately 2,000 men killed or wounded in V Corps' assault units, with the 29th Infantry Division's 116th Regiment effectively destroyed as a fighting unit. But the beach was no longer a killing ground. Follow-on waves were landing equipment and supplies, slowly and chaotically, but continuously. Engineers were clearing obstacles and beginning to grade roads up the bluffs. And critically, First Army had demonstrated that it could absorb catastrophic tactical failure and continue operating. The psychological impact on German commanders watching the battle was profound. They'd thrown everything at the Americans: perfect defensive terrain, surprise force positioning, favorable weather that degraded naval gunfire effectiveness, and Americans had still gotten off the beach. If Americans could succeed at Omaha despite that nightmare beginning, what would stop them elsewhere? Aboard Aachen, Hodges and his staff worked through the afternoon, compiling damage assessments and adjusting plans. The most immediate problem was getting the 2nd Infantry Division ashore to relieve decimated units from the first wave. The 2nd was in floating reserve, circling offshore, but Omaha's partially cleared exits couldn't handle division-sized movement. Hodges made another command decision: halt all non-essential supply shipments for 12 hours, use the beach capacity exclusively for combat troops. This meant First Army would be short of ammunition and food by D+2, but without more infantry on the ground, there'd be no D+2. Logistics officer protested that stopping supply flow violated every doctrine about maintaining continuous logistics pipelines. Hodges overruled them. "We can resupply later," he said. "We can't resurrect dead soldiers. Get the 2nd Division ashore." By late evening, lead elements of the 2nd Infantry Division were moving through Omaha Beach, climbing the bluffs to relieve exhausted troops who'd been fighting for 18 hours. The crisis had passed, barely. The margin between success and catastrophic failure at Omaha had been less than 1,000 yards of difficult terrain, and the courage of men too tired and scared to stop fighting when every instinct told them to. First Army had survived its first test, but as operations officers examined maps showing the actual ground captured versus objectives planned, the sobering reality became clear. They were already behind schedule, and the hedgerows of Normandy lay just ahead. The killing had barely begun. June 10, 1944, Captain Thomas Hooper of the 26th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, stood at the base of a hedgerow near the village of Caumont-Levante, France. 4 days into the invasion, his company had advanced exactly 4 miles inland from Omaha Beach. Those 4 miles had cost him 43 men, 30% of his rifle strength. He was staring at the obstacle that would define the next 7 weeks of First Army's combat operations. An earthen wall 6 feet high, topped with 3 feet of dense, thorny vegetation, backed by a drainage ditch 4 feet deep. The hedgerow stretched hundreds of yards in both directions, broken only by occasional narrow gates. Aerial reconnaissance photographs hadn't conveyed the true nature of these barriers. From the air, Normandy looked like patchwork farmland quilted by dark lines of vegetation. From the ground, it looked like nature had built an infinite maze of fortifications. Each field was a compartment roughly 100 yards square, surrounded on all sides by hedgerows that blocked visibility and channeled movement. For defending Germans, each hedgerow was a prepared fighting position. For attacking Americans, each field was a separate battle. And there were 50,000 of these barriers between First Army and its objectives. The tactical problem was fundamental and had no easy solution. American military doctrine in 1944 emphasized mobility and firepower. Infantry advanced behind artillery barrages, supported by tanks that provided mobile fire support, while infantry closed with enemy positions. In open terrain, deserts, plains, rolling hills, this doctrine worked beautifully. American superiority in artillery and armor overwhelmed German defensive positions through sheer volume of fire, forcing defenders to retreat or die. But hedgerows negated every American advantage. Artillery couldn't observe targets hidden behind earthen walls. Tanks couldn't maneuver when restricted to narrow lanes between fields. Infantry couldn't use their superior numbers when forced to attack through single gates that concentrated force into kill zones, and American advantages in air power became irrelevant when pilots couldn't see targets beneath tree canopy. The bocage, the French term for this hedgerow country, turned warfare into a series of close-range infantry fights where German defenders with machine guns and rifles could hold off American attackers with tanks and artillery. It was the perfect terrain for a well-trained defense force facing numerically superior attackers. First Army's initial advance through the hedgerows followed predictable patterns that made German defense easy. A typical attack began with artillery firing on suspected enemy positions, though without direct observation, gunners were essentially shooting blind. Infantry would then advance toward the first hedgerow, usually taking casualties from German machine guns, positioned to fire down lanes between fields. If Americans reached the hedgerow, they'd try to breach it by blowing a gap with explosives or using engineer equipment to create an opening. This process took time, often 20 to 30 minutes, during which German defenders in the next field could reposition to cover the breach. When Americans finally pushed through the gap, they'd emerge single file into the next field, where Germans would be waiting in prepared positions at the far hedgerow. Machine gun fire would sweep the Americans as they emerged. Those who survived would go prone, call for artillery, and wait for tanks to come up. But tanks couldn't easily get through the breached hedgerow because the gaps were typically too narrow or the ditches too steep. Eventually, after taking more casualties, Americans would secure the field and start the entire process over again at the next hedgerow. Average rate of advance, 3 to 5 fields per day. Average cost, 10 to 15 casualties per field. Math was brutal and simple. At that rate, reaching First Army's objectives would take months and cost tens of thousands of men. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges watched this disaster develop through June with growing alarm. Daily casualty reports showed First Army losing approximately 1,500 to 2,000 men per day, killed, wounded, and missing combined, while advancing an average of 600 yards. The exchange rate was unsustainable. At this pace, divisions would be combat ineffective in 30 days, long before reaching objectives. Hodges visited forward areas on June 18th, observing firsthand how hedgerows paralyzed American tactical advantages. He watched a Sherman tank approach a hedgerow, try to climb over it, and expose its thin belly armor to a hidden German anti-tank gun that destroyed the tank with a single shot. The 4-man crew bailed out, 3 of them on fire, while German machine gunners cut them down as they ran. Hodges turned to his aide and said quietly, "We're using World War I tactics in World War II terrain. This has to change." But changing required solving problems that weren't primarily military. The hedgerows weren't defending the Germans. The hedgerows were making American superiority irrelevant. The only way forward was innovation under fire, finding ways to make American strengths matter despite the terrain. The first tactical adaptations came from junior officers and NCOs, not from headquarters doctrine. Rifle company commanders began experimenting with different approaches to hedgerow fighting. Some tried night infiltration, sneaking through hedgerows under cover of darkness to attack German positions from unexpected directions. This worked occasionally, but required extensive rehearsal and got very risky when units lost contact in the darkness. Others tried using Bangalore torpedoes, long tubes of explosive designed to clear minefields, to blow holes in hedgerows. This was faster than engineer equipment, but still left Americans vulnerable while preparing and positioning the charges. A few innovative officers discovered they could suppress German defenders by having tanks fire directly into hedgerows from close range, using high explosive shells to shred vegetation and kill anyone hiding behind it. This worked, but consumed enormous amounts of ammunition, and was slow. What First Army needed was a way to get tanks through hedgerows quickly, without exposing their vulnerable undersides, allowing armor to provide direct fire support in the enclosed fields where infantry was dying. The solution came not from officers or planners, but from an enlisted tanker with a practical mind and access to German beach obstacles. Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron wasn't supposed to be inventing tank modifications. His unit conducted reconnaissance patrols, not assault operations. But Cullen had watched infantry struggle through the bocage and understood that tanks needed to break through hedgerows rather than climb over them. His insight was elegant. Use German beach obstacles as raw material for a cutting device. The steel hedgehogs that Germans had planted on Omaha and Utah beaches were made from railroad rails welded into X shapes, incredibly strong and available in quantity on every beach as engineers cleared obstacles. Cullen took 4 sections of rail, welded them to the front of a Sherman tank in a formation that resembled steel tusks or a plow, and tested the device against a hedgerow. The steel prongs bit into the earthen base, allowing the tank to power through the hedgerow at ground level rather than climbing over it. The modification worked brilliantly. A tank with Kuhlen's device could breach a hedgerow in 30 seconds, emerging into the next field with guns already bearing, able to suppress German positions immediately. First Army engineers examined the device, made minor improvements to strengthen welds and adjust angles. Then began mass production. By July 23, 1944, 7 weeks into the campaign, First Army had installed Kuhlen hedgerow cutters, nicknamed Rhinos or Tusks, on roughly 60% of its Sherman tanks. The impact on tactical operations was immediate. Tank infantry teams could now advance through bocage at roughly 3 times the previous speed. Instead of breaching a single hedgerow gap and funneling everyone through it, multiple tanks could breach hedgerows simultaneously at different points, making German defense much more difficult. Attacks that previously took a full day could now be completed in 4 to 6 hours. Casualty rates decreased because infantry spent less time trapped in exposed positions waiting for support. But even with rhinos, the advance remained grinding. German defenders adapted quickly, pulling back to intermediate hedgerows and ambushing American tanks as they emerged from breaches. The bocage still favored defense, and the calendar was becoming First Army's enemy. By mid-July, First Army had been in continuous combat for 42 days. Divisions showed signs of exhaustion. Veteran NCOs and junior officers, the men whose experience and leadership held units together, were being killed or wounded at rates that couldn't be replaced. Rifle companies authorized 193 men were operating at 60 to 70% strength, chronically short of the very infantrymen needed for close combat in hedgerows. The fall of St. Lo exemplified everything brutal about hedgerow warfare. St. Lo was a crossroads town of just 11,000 inhabitants, but it controlled the road network connecting Normandy's beach areas to the interior. First Army needed St. Lo to enable maneuver warfare once breakout occurred. The town was defended by German paratroopers from the 3rd Parachute Division, elite troops with extensive combat experience from Russia and Italy. Major General Charles Gerhardt's 29th Infantry Division received the mission to capture St. Lo in early July. The division had been rebuilt after its Omaha beach losses, but was still under strength and tired. The attack began July 11th. It immediately bogged down in hedgerow, fighting on the outskirts. German defenders turned every stone building into a fortress, every crossroads into a kill zone. American artillery pulverized the town, reducing much of its medieval architecture to rubble. But rubble was even better defensive terrain than buildings. Progress measured in yards per day. By July 18th, the 29th Division had penetrated to St. Lo's outskirts but was combat exhausted, having suffered over 3,000 casualties in 8 days. Gerhardt committed his final reserve battalion on July 18th. They entered St. Lo on July 19th, fighting house to house through burning ruins. German paratroopers finally withdrew on July 20th, having delayed First Army for 11 days and inflicted horrific casualties. The 29th Division's after-action report for St. Lo was stark. Division captured one crossroads town at cost of 4,000 casualties. Offensive combat capability significantly reduced. Recommend minimum 2 weeks reconstitution before further operations. First Army didn't have 2 weeks to spare. By July 24th, 49 days into the campaign, First Army had advanced approximately 25 miles from its beachhead, less than half the distance planners had projected for D+49. Casualty rates exceeded replacement rates for the first time. First Army had suffered approximately 40,000 casualties since D-Day, killed, wounded, and missing, while receiving only 32,000 replacements. The 8,000-man deficit meant divisions were shrinking even as they fought. Worse, the replacement system sent individual soldiers rather than cohesive units, meaning replacements arrived without the small unit cohesion and collective experience that kept men alive. A replacement arriving alone in a veteran company faced survival odds significantly worse than a veteran surrounded by experienced soldiers he'd trained with. The morale impact was insidious. Veterans watched new men die within days or hours of arrival. sometimes before anyone learned their names, creating a sense that individual life had become disposable. Letters home, monitored by sensors, began showing strain. One letter from a 1st Division sergeant, declassified in 1976, captured the growing desperation. "We've been fighting 45 days straight. No rest. Men falling asleep standing up. Can't remember what it's like not being shot at. Lost my squad leader yesterday. Third one since we landed. Starting to think we're gonna fight through every damn hedgerow in France until we're all dead. Somebody better figure out a better way to do this, or there won't be anyone left." Hodges read summaries of these letters. He knew First Army was approaching a breaking point. Either operations needed to pause for reconstitution, allowing divisions to absorb replacements and recover combat effectiveness, or First Army needed a breakthrough that bypassed the bocage entirely. Pausing was politically impossible. Churchill and Roosevelt were demanding visible progress. That left only breakthrough. And the plan for breakthrough was already being prepared, a massive aerial bombardment that would try to accomplish through air power what ground forces couldn't achieve through infantry fighting. It was called Operation Cobra, and everything depended on it working. July 10th, 1944. Winston Churchill sat in the cabinet war rooms beneath Whitehall, London, reading intelligence summaries from Normandy with mounting frustration. 6 weeks after D-Day, Allied forces controlled a beachhead roughly 50 miles wide and 25 miles deep, an area smaller than metropolitan London. American forces under Bradley had captured the Cotentin Peninsula and Cherbourg, but remained stuck in the bocage south of the original landing zones. British and Canadian forces under Montgomery had stalled outside Caen, a city they were supposed to capture on D-Day itself. Meanwhile, German divisions continued flowing into Normandy, and Soviet advances in the east, though spectacular, made the Western Allies' slow progress look embarrassing by comparison. Churchill drafted a personal telegram to President Franklin Roosevelt, marking it most secret and personal. The message was blunt. "Our forces appear to have developed trench warfare mentality. Montgomery assures me breakthrough is imminent, but he assured me of this 3 weeks ago. Bradley's Americans fight bravely, but advance measured in yards. Meanwhile, Stalin's armies advance kilometers per day. We must consider whether current commanders are suitable for mobile warfare this campaign requires." The telegram represented more than frustration. It was the opening move in a political crisis that would place enormous pressure on First Army to achieve immediate results regardless of cost. The political stakes extended beyond military embarrassment. Britain's home front was under sustained attack from V-1 flying bombs, the unmanned cruise missiles Germans called Vergeltungswaffe, vengeance weapons. The V-1 launch sites were scattered across the Pas-de-Calais region, roughly 200 miles northeast of Normandy, well beyond the range of any ground offensive from the current beachhead. The weapons killed indiscriminately, striking London and southern England with no warning beyond the sound of their pulse-jet engines. Between June 13th and July 10th, V-1 strikes had killed over 2,500 British civilians and wounded 7,000 more. The psychological impact was severe. Unlike conventional bombing, where people could take shelter during air raids, V-1 struck randomly at all hours. Parliament demanded action. Churchill needed results he could show the British people. That meant either capturing the launch sites through rapid ground advance or forcing Germany to pull divisions from the west to defend against Soviet offensives. Neither was happening. The Normandy campaign appeared stuck in a stalemate that gave Germany time to perfect its vengeance weapons and potentially deploy even worse systems that intelligence agencies knew were under development. The Soviet context made Allied problems more acute. On June 23rd, the Red Army had launched Operation Bagration, a massive offensive against German Army Group Center in Belarus. In 3 weeks, Soviet forces advanced over 200 miles, destroying 28 German divisions and inflicting over 400,000 casualties. The scale and speed of Bagration dwarfed anything happening in Normandy. Western newspapers noted the contrast. While Soviet armies raced toward Poland, American and British forces measured progress in Norman villages. Stalin himself raised the comparison in diplomatic communications. On July 7th, The Soviet leader sent Eisenhower a message congratulating Allied forces on capturing Cherbourg, but noting that the Red Army has liberated Minsk, Vitebsk, Mogilev, and advanced to within 100 kilometers of Warsaw, while our Western allies secure their initial beachhead. The message was diplomatically phrased, but contained unmistakable subtext. The Soviets were winning the war, while the Anglo-Americans consolidated positions. This created dangerous political dynamics. If the Western Front remained stagnant while the Soviets pushed toward Berlin, post-war Europe's political geography would be determined entirely by Soviet military positions. That prospect horrified Churchill and Roosevelt equally, if for different reasons. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower felt the pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Churchill's barely disguised threats to recommend command changes. Roosevelt's concern about American public opinion if casualties continued mounting without visible progress. Montgomery's assurances that he was drawing German armor onto the British sector to enable American breakout, assurances that became less credible each week. British forces failed to capture Caen, and Bradley's reports that First Army was bleeding itself white in the bocage without achieving breakthrough. On July 12th, Eisenhower traveled from Chaff headquarters to First Army's command post at Colombières to meet directly with Bradley and Hodges. The meeting was officially described as a planning conference. In reality, it was Eisenhower delivering an ultimatum. According to Bradley's post-war memoir and notes taken by First Army staff officers, Eisenhower was more direct than usual. "We need decisive action within 10 days, he told Bradley and Hodges. Not incremental progress, not preparing for future operations. Actual breakthrough. Churchill is talking about command changes. I've defended both of you, but I can't do it indefinitely without results." It was the first time Eisenhower had given Bradley or Hodges a specific deadline for operational results. The message was clear: produce a breakthrough or be relieved. Bradley had been developing a breakthrough plan since late June, but Eisenhower's pressure accelerated its timeline. The concept was straightforward in theory, revolutionary in execution. First Army would concentrate overwhelming force on a narrow front, roughly 7,000 yards wide, and use strategic heavy bombers to obliterate German defenses before ground forces attacked. The air component was unprecedented. Previous operations had used tactical bombers and fighter bombers for close air support. Bradley wanted to use heavy bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, the same aircraft that bombed German cities and factories, and point them at enemy front lines just hundreds of yards from American positions. The bombing weight would be enormous, over 4,000 tons of high explosive delivered in approximately 90 minutes, creating a carpet of destruction that would simply erase German defensive positions. After the bombing, First Army's 7th Corps, under General J. Lawton Collins, would attack through the shattered zone and exploit into open country beyond the bocage. Success would break the stalemate. Failure would waste scarce bomber resources and possibly kill thousands of American soldiers through mistaken bombing. Bradley named it Operation Cobra, after the snake, deadly, fast-striking, and focused. The planning for Cobra revealed tensions between Air Force and ground commanders about how air power should support ground operations. The U.S. 8th Air Force, which would provide the heavy bombers, was accustomed to strategic bombing missions where acceptable target error was measured in hundreds of yards, close enough when bombing industrial complexes but catastrophic when friendly troops were nearby. Air Force planners wanted the bomb line, the boundary between friendly and enemy positions, set at least 3,000 yards from American front lines to provide safety margin. Bradley rejected this. 3,000 yards meant the bombing would hit German rear areas rather than frontline defenses, allowing German forward positions to survive and conduct defense during the ground attack. Bradley demanded the bomb line be placed just 1,200 yards from American positions, close enough that bombs would destroy the frontline German units that were actually stopping First Army's advance. Air Force commanders protested this was dangerously close. Bradley insisted. The final compromise set the bomb line at 1,500 yards. Even this made Air Force planners nervous. They knew that in large-scale bombing operations, some aircraft would inevitably drop short of their aiming points due to equipment malfunction, pilot error, or wind drift. With American troops just 1,500 yards away, short bombing would hit friendly forces. The Air Force demanded First Army pull its frontline troops back 2,000 yards before the bombing began, creating a buffer zone. Bradley agreed reluctantly, but knew this withdrawal would alert Germans that something unusual was happening. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges participated in Cobra planning, but expressed private reservations to his staff. His concerns weren't about the concept, but about the risks. First Army would be committing its last substantial reserves to a single narrow attack. If Cobra failed, there was no backup plan and no fresh divisions to try again elsewhere. Worse, the preliminary bombardment would consume most of First Army's allocated air support for July, leaving other sectors without close air support if the Germans counterattacked. And the 2,000-yard withdrawal before bombing would surrender hard-won territory that had cost American lives to capture. If the bombing failed to destroy German defenses, those positions would need to be recaptured through conventional attack, essentially fighting the same battles twice. Hodges' staff diary from July 15th records his assessment. Cobra is high-risk operation made necessary by political pressure rather than military logic. Tactical situation doesn't require breakthrough. Methodical advance would eventually clear Bocage. But political factors demand rapid results. We'll execute as ordered, but consequences of failure would be severe. Despite these reservations, Hodges threw First Army's resources into preparing for Cobra. 7th Corps conducted rehearsals. Artillery pre-registered targets along the attack route. Engineers stockpiled bridging equipment for rapid river crossings once exploitation began. The machine Hodges had built would attempt something it wasn't designed for, a gamble rather than methodical operation. Everything now depended on the bombers hitting their targets. The political pressure intensified further on July 20th, when German officers attempted to assassinate Adolf Hitler at his Wolfslair headquarters in East Prussia. The bomb exploded during a staff conference, killing several officers but leaving Hitler alive with minor injuries. The assassination attempt, led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg and other German military officers, failed when Hitler survived, and the conspirators' plans to seize control of the German government collapsed. Within days, Hitler ordered mass arrests of suspected conspirators, executing thousands of officers and officials. From the Allied perspective, the failed assassination had contradictory implications. On one hand, it revealed internal German opposition to Hitler and suggested German morale might be cracking. On the other hand, Hitler's survival and the subsequent purges actually strengthened his grip on the military by removing potential resistors. For Churchill and Roosevelt, the assassination attempt created brief hope that Germany might seek negotiated peace, followed by disappointment when Hitler consolidated control instead. This further increased pressure on Allied commanders to deliver military victories that might finish the war before Germany deployed additional vengeance weapons or developed other war-winning technologies intelligence suggested were under development. By July 24th, the day before Cobra's scheduled execution, Hodges understood that his career and First Army's reputation rested on the operation's success. Eisenhower had made clear that breakthrough must happen immediately. Bradley had staked his credibility on Cobra's innovative use of air power. Collins and 7th Corps had trained specifically for exploitation operations. The political and military alignment was complete. But Hodges also understood that alignment didn't guarantee success. Weather remained unpredictable. Heavy clouds could force postponement. The Air Force's ability to hit targets just 1,500 yards from American lines remained unproven. German defenders might recover faster than planners expected, or might have prepared fallback positions beyond the bombing zone. 1,000 variables could derail the operation. On the evening of July 24th, Hodges met privately with 7th Corps Commander General Collins at First Army headquarters. According to Collins' post-war memoir, Hodges' guidance was characteristically direct. Tomorrow we'll learn whether we've built an army that can exploit success or just survive failure. If the bombing works and you break through, don't stop for anything short of fuel running out. If it doesn't work, we'll be back in the hedgerows for another month, and I'll probably be headed home. Collins assured him 7 Corps was ready. Hodges replied. "I know you are. The question is whether Washington and London will give us time to prove it." The comment captured Hodges' fundamental frustration. He was fighting two wars simultaneously, one against the Germans and one against political pressure from capitals that didn't understand ground combat's realities. Tomorrow would determine which war he'd lose first. The human cost of the political pressure was visible in First Army casualty statistics. Between July 10th and July 24th, the 2 weeks of intense planning for Cobra, First Army suffered approximately 6,000 casualties, while maintaining offensive pressure along the entire front to prevent German reinforcement of the Cobra sector. Many of these casualties came from attacks that had primarily diversionary purposes rather than operational necessity, designed to keep Germans focused elsewhere while 7 Corps prepared. First Army operations officers knew these diversionary attacks would cost lives without achieving significant territorial gains. They ordered them anyway because Cobra's success required German attention divided. The families of men killed in diversionary attacks would never know their sons died, not to capture ground, but to distract enemy attention. The letters home spoke of heroism and sacrifice. The staff diaries spoke of calculated expenditure of lives to create conditions for breakthrough elsewhere. This was the arithmetic of modern warfare that generals understood but couldn't publicly acknowledge. Men died for political timelines as surely as for military objectives. And tomorrow, when Operation Cobra began, that arithmetic would reach its most extreme expression. Thousands of tons of bombs dropped within yards of American soldiers, accepting that some would die from friendly fire because the political imperative for breakthrough exceeded the tactical imperative for safety. Courtney Hodges had built a machine designed for methodical warfare. Now politicians demanded he use it for desperate gambles. Tomorrow would reveal whether the machine could survive being used for purposes beyond its design parameters. July 25th, 1944, 0900 hours. The sound began as distant thunder, rolling across Norman farmland from the north. American soldiers crouching in foxholes along the Perrier-Saint-Lô road looked up nervously, scanning the overcast sky. They had pulled back 2,000 yards from their frontline positions at dawn, creating a buffer zone between themselves and the area about to be bombed. The withdrawal had felt wrong, surrendering ground they'd bled for, but orders were absolute. Now, as the sound grew louder, soldiers could distinguish individual engine notes, not thunder, hundreds of aircraft engines. The 1st and 9th Air Forces were arriving, carrying 4,700 tons of high explosive to be dropped on a rectangle of French countryside, 7,000 yards wide and 2,500 yards deep. Inside that rectangle, German forces from the Panzer Lehr Division and elements of 2 infantry divisions waited in positions hardened over 6 weeks of continuous combat. They had watched Americans withdraw during the night and knew something unusual was coming, but nothing in their experience prepared them for what happened next. At 0938, the first bombs began falling. Within 90 minutes, the landscape itself would cease to exist as recognizable terrain. The bombing plan called for sequential waves of different aircraft types, each delivering different ordnance optimized for specific destruction purposes. Fighter bombers came first, strafing German positions with machine guns and dropping napalm to ignite vegetation and exposed equipment. Then medium bombers, B-26s and A-20 attack bombers, delivered 1,000-pound high-explosive bombs aimed at specific coordinates where intelligence suggested German strongpoints existed. Finally, the heavy bombers arrived, over 1,500 B-17 flying fortresses, and B-24 Liberators in formation waves stretching 40 miles through the sky. Each heavy bomber carried 12 500-pound bombs, or 6 1,000-pound bombs. They flew perpendicular to the front line, approaching from the north, releasing bombs at 15,000 feet altitude. At that height, bombardiers aimed using Norden bomb sights, precision instruments that calculated release points based on airspeed, altitude, and wind. The system worked reasonably well when bombing large stationary targets like factories. When bombing a narrow strip of countryside with American soldiers 1,500 yards away, precision became survival matter. The first waves hit their targets accurately. Then smoke from exploding bombs obscured the target area. Later, waves bombed through smoke using radar and dead reckoning. That's when the disaster began. At approximately 1000 hours, bombs from the 73rd wave of B-17 bombers fell short of the target zone. Instead of hitting German positions, they struck American positions of the 30th Infantry Division, which was positioned closest to the bomb line as the assault division for Cobra. The bombing was catastrophic. 500-pound bombs falling from 15,000 feet, impact with enough force to create craters 20 feet across and 10 feet deep. Blast waves kill everyone within 100 yards. Shrapnel wounds everyone within 200 yards. The concussion alone can rupture lungs and eardrums at ranges beyond visible injury. Men in foxholes die from overpressure that turns their internal organs to jelly while leaving external bodies unmarked. Those who survived the first short bombings described the experience as hell manifesting on Earth. Private Raymond Smithson of the 30th Division, interviewed in 1983, recalled, "The ground came up and slapped me like a giant hand. Couldn't hear anything except ringing. Looked up and saw more planes coming. Realized they were bombing us. Started screaming for people to get out of the holes. Better to be above ground and risk shrapnel than buried alive when the bombs caved in the foxholes. Guys running in every direction. Another wave hit. Bodies flying through the air. Trees exploding. Smoke so thick you couldn't see 10 feet. Thought the world was ending." Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in action during the entire European theater, died in the short bombing that morning. McNair, a 3-star general and former commander of Army ground forces, had come forward to observe Cobra firsthand. He was in a forward observation post with officers from the 30th Division when bombs struck their position. McNair was killed instantly by a direct hit. His body was so badly damaged that identification was only possible through uniform insignia and personal effects. The death of a lieutenant general from friendly fire was unprecedented and deeply embarrassing to the Army Air Forces, who'd insisted they could deliver bombs accurately at close range. McNair's death was initially kept secret. His family was notified, but press was told only that an unnamed senior officer had been killed in action. The truth emerged slowly, heavily censored. For the soldiers of the 30th Division who'd lost comrades to American bombs, McNair's death provided cold comfort. At least commanders shared the risks they imposed on frontline troops. But it didn't change the grim mathematics. The short bombing killed 111 American soldiers and wounded 490 on July 25th, hours before Cobra's ground attack even began. First Army had accepted these casualties as acceptable cost of using strategic bombers for tactical support. The question now was whether the bombing's destructive effects on German defenders justified the friendly fire deaths. The bombing's impact on German forces exceeded even optimistic predictions. Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's elite armored formations, essentially ceased to exist as a fighting unit in 90 minutes. The division commander, Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, survived the bombing by taking shelter in a concrete bunker, but reported afterward that 70% of his division's equipment was destroyed and 30% of personnel were casualties, killed, wounded, or too psychologically traumatized to fight. Bayerlein's official report to higher headquarters, captured after the war and translated by U.S. Army historians, described conditions in almost apocalyptic terms. "My front lines appeared to have been torn from the ground, craters of 8 to 10 meters depth, telephone communications completely destroyed, radio contact impossible due to electrical interference from bomb explosions. When bombing stopped, I attempted to assess situation and found most position occupied by dead or insane soldiers. Those still living were incapable of rational thought. Veterans of Russian front stated they had never experienced bombardment of this intensity. Division cannot conduct organized defense. The report provided validation that strategic bombing could, under specific circumstances, achieve tactical effects impossible through conventional artillery. But it also revealed the limitations. The bombing worked perfectly against stationary defenders in the target zone, but had minimal effect on German forces outside the bombing rectangle who could rush reinforcements once the attack began. At 1300 hours, 3.5 hours after the bombing ended, Seventh Corps' ground attack began. The assault divisions, 9th Infantry Division, 4th Infantry Division, and 1st Infantry Division, advanced cautiously into the bombed zone, uncertain what they'd find. Initial reports suggested complete success. German resistance was sporadic and disorganized. Forward units reported finding German soldiers wandering aimlessly, weapons abandoned, mentally broken by the bombardment. Tank infantry teams advanced through churned earth where hedgerows had been obliterated by bombs, finally able to maneuver without the constrictions that had paralyzed previous attacks. By 1600 hours, laid elements had penetrated 3 miles beyond the original front line, further than any First Army advance had achieved in a single day since D-Day. By nightfall, 7th Corps had torn a gap in German lines wide enough to begin exploitation. General Collins committed his armor reserves, 2nd Armored Division and 3rd Armored Division, to exploit the breakthrough. This was the moment Cobra was designed to create. American armor formations operating in open terrain against disorganized German defenses, able to use mobility and firepower advantages that hedgerows had negated for 7 weeks. The gamble was working. The question now was whether 7th Corps could exploit fast enough to prevent German recovery. The exploitation phase of Cobra revealed First Army's growing sophistication in combined arms warfare. Collins didn't just send tanks forward blindly. He created armored task forces, combined formations of tanks, tank destroyers, mechanized infantry, engineers, and self-propelled artillery that could fight independently while maintaining the speed necessary for exploitation. Each task force numbered roughly 2,000 soldiers with 40 to 60 tanks, organized around specific objectives: capture crossroads, seize bridges, bypass German strongpoints, and penetrate to rear areas where logistics and command functions were vulnerable. The task force concept was borrowed from German Kampfgruppe organization, but adapted to American strengths in logistics and communications. American task forces maintained radio contact with headquarters, could call for air support through forward air controllers traveling with lead units, and were supplied by truck convoys that followed directly behind combat units. This allowed sustained advance without pausing to establish formal supply lines. On July 27th, just 2 days into Cobra's exploitation phase, 7th Corps' leading task forces had advanced 12 miles, equal to the total advance achieved in the previous 49 days. The bocage was behind them. Ahead lay relatively open country where American mobility advantages would determine outcomes. Coutances fell on July 28th after German defenders abandoned the town rather than be encircled by American armor attacking from multiple directions. Avranches, the gateway to Brittany, fell on July 30th. With Avranches secured, First Army had achieved breakthrough from Normandy into the interior of France. The exploitation could now expand from one corps to multiple armies. On August 1st, 3rd Army under George Patton became operational, taking control of the 8th Corps and 15th Corps, and beginning the famous dash across France that would make Patton a household name. But 3rd Army's success was only possible because 1st Army had executed Cobra and torn open German defenses. 7th Corps, 9th Corps, and V Corps remained under 1st Army control, continuing to grind through German resistance northwest of Avranches, while Patton's forces exploited southward. The two-army system reflected Omar Bradley's promotion to 12th Army Group Command on August 1st, with Courtney Hodges formally assuming command of 1st Army. The command change received minimal press coverage. Most reporters focused on Patton's activation and 3rd Army's dramatic advances. Hodges' assumption of command of the largest American field army in Europe rated 3 sentences in most newspaper accounts. The invisibility of 1st Army was already becoming institutionalized. The cost-benefit analysis of Cobra would be debated by military historians for decades. The friendly fire casualties on July 25th, 111 dead, 490 wounded, represented the single highest casualty count from friendly fire in any American operation during World War II. These deaths were entirely preventable. Had the Air Force agreed to bomb farther from American lines, or had 1st Army accepted slower advance through conventional tactics, those men would have lived. But measured against the operational results, the calculation was grimmer. Cobra achieved breakthrough that ended the Normandy stalemate, enabled maneuver warfare that would characterize operations for the rest of the campaign, and inflicted catastrophic losses on German divisions that couldn't be quickly replaced. First Army suffered approximately 2,000 casualties during Cobra's 7 days, July 25th through July 31st, while advancing 35 miles and destroying or crippling 5 German divisions. The 7 weeks before Cobra had cost 40,000 casualties for 25 miles of advance. By those metrics, Cobra was extraordinarily cost-effective despite its horrific beginning. But the soldiers killed by American bombs didn't appear in calculations of operational success. Their deaths were classified as combat casualties. Their families never told. The bombs came from friendly aircraft. The lies necessary to maintain morale were built into the system. On July 31st, as First Army completed its 7th day of exploitation, Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges issued his first order of the day as confirmed First Army commander. The message was typically brief and unadorned. First Army has broken German defenses in Normandy and opened route to interior France. All personnel performed with courage and determination despite difficult circumstances. Operations continue. Maintain momentum. No mention of Cobra by name. No reference to the bombing or friendly fire casualties. No congratulations on breakthrough that changed the campaign's entire dynamic. Just acknowledgement of accomplishment and direction to keep moving. The order reflected Hodges' personality perfectly. Professional recognition of work done, immediate refocus on work remaining. It also reflected his understanding of First Army's role. While Third Army would receive publicity for exploitation, First Army's job was to maintain pressure on German forces northwest of the breakthrough, preventing them from counterattacking into Patton's flank. First Army would fight the methodical, unglamorous battles that made Third Army's dashing advances possible. The invisible army would remain invisible by design, doing the essential work that enabled the visible armies to shine. Cobra had proven First Army could execute high-risk operations successfully. The next 2 months would prove it could sustain operations across hundreds of miles while maintaining operational coherence. The killing had been terrible. The killing would continue. But the stalemate was broken. And that, ultimately, was all that political masters in Washington and London demanded. The Army had delivered. Now it would be systematically erased from the history being written in real time by press officers who had specific orders about which armies to make famous and which to ignore. August 1st, 1944. Tanks of the 3rd Armored Division rolled through the town of Mayenne, France, 80 miles south of the Normandy coast. Lieutenant Colonel Leander Doane, commanding a task force of approximately 50 Sherman tanks and 500 mechanized infantry, radioed back to division headquarters with a situation report. His units had captured Mayenne against light resistance. German defenders had withdrawn rather than fight. The road to the Loire River lay open. Doane's problem wasn't tactical, it was mechanical. His tanks were running on fumes. Fuel gauges showed empty. Drivers were operating on reserve tanks that held enough gasoline for perhaps 10 more miles. The exploitation that Operation Cobra had enabled was moving so fast that First Army's logistics system couldn't keep pace. Supply trucks were driving round the clock, but still falling behind combat units advancing 20 miles per day. Doane's radio message was professionally calm, but contained an edge of desperation. Request immediate fuel delivery. Task force stopped, not by enemy action, but by empty gas tanks. Can continue exploitation if resupplied within 6 hours. Without fuel, position untenable if Germans counterattack. The message encapsulated First Army's newest problem. Success had become its own obstacle. The Bocage stalemate was over. Now First Army faced the challenge of sustaining operations across distances and at speeds no one had planned for. The strategic situation had transformed completely in 7 days. Operation Cobra's breakthrough had torn a gap in German defensive lines, wide enough to drive entire armies through. On August 1st, Third Army under Patton became operational, immediately driving west into Brittany to capture ports and south toward the Loire River to protect the expanding Allied flank. First Army retained 3 corps, V Corps, 7 Corps, and 9 Corps, and continued attacking southeast from the Cobra breakthrough zone, maintaining pressure on German forces that were trying to establish defensive positions farther inland. Bradley, now commanding 12th Army Group, coordinated both armies from a mobile headquarters that tried to keep pace with the advance. The movement was so rapid that maps became obsolete within days. Front lines that cartographers carefully drew each evening would be 15 miles further east by the following morning. German units that intelligence officers identified in specific towns would have withdrawn or been overrun before their positions could be attacked. For the first time since D-Day, American forces were fighting the kind of mobile warfare their doctrine had been designed for. The question was whether American logistics, designed to support methodical advances measured in miles per week, could adapt to exploitation measured in miles per day. The logistics mathematics were brutal. A single American armored division in 1944 consumed approximately 50,000 gallons of gasoline per day during active operations. First Army had 3 armored divisions plus numerous independent tank battalions, tank destroyer units, and mechanized infantry. Total fuel consumption ran to several 100,000 gallons daily, just for vehicles, before accounting for the thousands of trucks needed to haul ammunition, food, medical supplies, and replacement equipment forward. All of this fuel and supplies flowed from Normandy beaches and the partially repaired port of Cherbourg, traveling along roads that hadn't been designed for military traffic and were being destroyed by thousands of heavy vehicles driving over them continuously. The supply distance from beach to front line, which had been 10 miles in late June, was now over 100 miles by early August and growing longer every day. Every additional mile increased delivery time, required more trucks just to maintain the same supply flow, and created more opportunities for breakdowns, accidents, or enemy interdiction. The logistics system that had barely sustained operations during the Hedgerow fighting was now being asked to sustain armies advancing 10 times faster across 10 times greater distance. Something had to break. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges understood the logistics crisis, but faced impossible choices about how to address it. He could slow First Army's advance to allow supply buildup, but that would give Germans time to establish defensive positions that would require costly attacks to breach. He could prioritize certain divisions for supply, giving them enough fuel to continue advancing while other divisions paused, but that risked having supplied units advance so far ahead of unsupplied units that gaps opened in the line. Or he could accept that his entire army would advance until running out of fuel, then pause wherever they stopped, while logistics caught up, essentially surrendering operational control to supply limitations. Hodges chose a hybrid approach. He designated 7th Corps, commanded by the aggressive General Collins, as First Army's exploitation force and prioritized it for fuel and ammunition. The Corps would advance as far as possible, while V Corps and 9th Corps followed at slower pace, securing territory and maintaining continuous front. This created acceptable risk. 7th Corps might become isolated if Germans counterattacked, but the speed of its advance would disrupt German efforts to organize such counterattacks. It was calculated gamble that depended on German disorganization, persisting longer than American supply problems. The human experience of the exploitation phase was profoundly different from hedgerow fighting. Soldiers who'd spent July taking casualties to advance 300 yards per day suddenly found themselves driving through French towns that offered no resistance. Civilians lined streets waving French flags and offering wine, cheese, and flowers. Combat that had been constant for weeks became intermittent. Brief firefights when encountering German rearguards, followed by hours of movement through undefended territory. The psychological impact was disorienting. Men who'd developed the hypervigilance necessary to survive hedgerow combat now had to constantly shift between alertness and relaxation as the tactical situation changed every few miles. Some soldiers embraced the liberation atmosphere, trading cigarettes and chocolate for fresh food, and enjoying rare moments when French civilians treated them as heroes rather than just soldiers passing through. Others remained withdrawn, too conditioned by weeks of close combat to trust the apparent peace. Medical officers noted increased psychosomatic complaints during the exploitation, stomach problems, headaches, sleep disturbances, symptoms of stress manifesting now that immediate survival pressures had temporarily eased. The pursuit revealed how thoroughly Cobra had shattered German defensive coherence in the breakthrough sector. First Army intelligence officers, interrogating captured German soldiers, learned that many units had completely lost contact with higher headquarters during the bombing and subsequent exploitation. German divisions that had been full-strength formations in mid-July were now scattered groups of a few hundred soldiers trying to find their parent units while retreating eastward. Equipment losses were catastrophic. Many German infantry soldiers had abandoned heavy weapons while withdrawing, reducing them to rifle-armed groups with no machine guns or mortars. German artillery had withdrawn so quickly that many batteries left their guns behind rather than take time to limber them for movement. The material cost to Germany was immense, but the psychological cost was perhaps greater. German soldiers who'd successfully defended the bocage for 7 weeks suddenly found themselves retreating continuously, never able to establish defensive positions before American forces appeared. The mythology of German military invincibility that had sustained soldiers through years of war was cracking under the sustained pressure of pursuit warfare, where German tactical skill couldn't compensate for American material superiority. On August 8th, First Army operations reached a new crisis point. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force issued orders splitting operational control in ways that would complicate First Army's advance. As part of a broader plan to trap German forces retreating from Normandy, Bradley ordered First Army's 15th Corps, which had been fighting alongside 7th Corps, transferred to Patton's 3rd Army. 15th Corps would drive north from Le Mans toward Argenton, while British and Canadian forces drove south from Caen toward Falaise, creating a pocket that would encircle German's 7th Army. First Army's remaining corps would continue driving southeast, maintaining pressure but not participating in the encirclement battle. The decision made operational sense but created frustration among First Army commanders who saw their most mobile corps transferred away just as exploitation was succeeding. Hodges privately expressed concern to Bradley that stripping 15th Corps from First Army would reduce pressure on Germans retreating ahead of 7th Corps and 8th Corps, allowing them to escape when they might otherwise be captured. Bradley overruled the concern. Political and strategic requirements to demonstrate Allied cooperation by involving British forces in major encirclement took precedence over First Army's tactical preferences. It was another instance where First Army's interests were subordinated to broader needs, and another moment when its contributions would be obscured in historical accounts that emphasized the Falaise encirclement, while downplaying First Army's role in creating conditions that made the encirclement possible. The fuel crisis reached critical levels on August 15th. First Army's 7th Corps, driving toward Chartres, reported 90% of its vehicles deadlined, military terminology for non-operational, due to empty fuel tanks or mechanical breakdowns. The division couldn't continue exploitation. It couldn't even withdraw if ordered because tanks wouldn't run. Collins placed his divisions in defensive positions and waited for resupply. The pause allowed German forces ahead of 7th Corps to withdraw unmolested, escaping what might have been encirclement if American advance had continued another day. The situation repeated across First Army's front. 9th Corps stopped near Dreux for lack of fuel. V Corps, approaching Paris from the west, rationed fuel by allowing only essential movement. Combat operations continued, but at dramatically reduced tempo. The Red Ball Express, a dedicated truck convoy system that began operations on August 21st, tried to address the crisis. The system dedicated thousands of trucks exclusively to hauling supplies from Normandy ports to forward areas, operating 24 hours per day on one-way routes that gave convoys priority over all other traffic. Roughly 70% of Red Ball Express drivers were African American soldiers from quartermaster truck companies, performing absolutely essential work while serving in a segregated army that gave them no recognition. Even with Red Ball Express operating at maximum capacity, delivery rates couldn't match consumption rates. First Army was burning through supplies faster than logistics could deliver them. By August 25th, First Army had been fighting continuously for 80 days since D-Day, longer than any American army had sustained operations without pause since the Civil War. The advance from Normandy beaches to positions east of Paris covered approximately 250 miles in linear distance, though actual movement was far greater due to twisting routes through French road networks. Casualties since D-Day totaled approximately 70,000, killed, wounded, and missing, out of roughly 250,000 soldiers who'd served in First Army during that period. Some divisions had been functionally rebuilt multiple times as casualties were replaced. The 1st Infantry Division, in continuous combat since D-Day, had lost over 12,000 men by late August, approaching 100% turnover of its authorized strength. The human cost of exploitation was less visible than hedgerow fighting because casualty rates per day were lower, but cumulative losses were staggering, and those losses were creating capability problems. Experienced junior officers and NCOs, the men who made infantry companies effective, were being killed or wounded faster than they could be replaced with equivalently trained personnel. Replacements arrived with basic training, but without combat experience, creating units where 50% of soldiers had never been in sustained combat. These inexperienced units would face experienced German defenders in the battles ahead. The disparity would exact its own cost. The liberation of Paris, which began on August 23rd and culminated on August 25th, exemplified the complex relationship between military necessity and political reality. First Army's V Corps and French 2nd Armored Division, attached to First Army for the operation, entered Paris on August 25th to wild celebrations. Over 1 million Parisians lined the streets as American and Free French forces paraded through the city. General Charles de Gaulle led a triumphant march down the Champs-Élysées, re-establishing French sovereignty after 4 years of German occupation. For propaganda purposes, the liberation was perfect, vivid images of freedom restored that would dominate newsreels worldwide. For operational purposes, it was a disaster. Paris consumed 4,000 tons of supplies per day to feed and support its 2 million inhabitants. The city's infrastructure was damaged, requiring immediate repairs to electricity, water, and transportation systems. Civil administration needed to be re-established. German prisoners needed to be secured. All of this consumed First Army resources at the moment when those resources were desperately needed to sustain exploitation. Hodges had argued against liberating Paris immediately, suggesting First Army bypass it to maintain momentum, while leaving garrison forces to accept the city's eventual surrender. He was overruled. Political necessity trumped military logic. The images of liberated Paris would help sustain Allied morale and demonstrate progress to skeptical publics in Britain and America. The operational cost, 6 days of delayed operations while Paris was secured and supplied, would be borne silently by First Army units that watched German forces escape eastward during the pause. On August 31st, First Army resumed full offensive operations after the Paris pause. The advance continued eastward toward the German border. But the character of operations had changed. German forces, shattered and disorganized during the Cobra exploitation, were beginning to coalesce into coherent defensive formations again. The approaches to Germany offered better defensive terrain than central France. Rivers running west to east provided natural obstacles. Towns offered urban fighting positions, and German supply lines were shortening as Allied lines lengthened. The pursuit warfare that had characterized August was transitioning toward attritional fighting that would characterize autumn and winter. First Army had achieved extraordinary operational success in August, advancing 250 miles, liberating half of France, inflicting catastrophic losses on German forces. But the invisible quality of that success was already established. Newspapers focused on Patton and Third Army. Historians would focus on Montgomery and British forces. First Army's role would be relegated to supporting character in a drama where others received starring credit. Courtney Hodges understood this and accepted it as the price of being the professional soldier in an army that celebrated personalities. The machine he'd built had performed brilliantly. That the machine's work went unrecognized was irrelevant to the next task. German border lay ahead. The Siegfried Line awaited, and the hardest fighting of the campaign was about to begin. August 19th, 1944. In a commandeered schoolhouse in Rambouillet, France, Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges stood before a large-scale map of Paris and its approaches, listening to a proposal he'd hoped to avoid. Major General Jacques Leclerc, commander of the French 2nd Armored Division attached to First Army, was making an impassioned argument for immediate liberation of Paris. Leclerc's intelligence officers had received reports that French resistance forces inside Paris had begun an uprising against German occupation forces on August 18th. The uprising was premature and poorly coordinated, likely to be crushed by German garrison troops within days unless Allied forces intervened. Leclerc wanted authorization to detach his division from First Army's line of advance and race directly to Paris, 50 miles northeast. Supreme Commander Eisenhower had already indicated willingness to support Paris liberation if military situation permitted. Hodges' problem was that military situation emphatically did not permit. First Army's 3 Corps were pursuing retreating German forces eastward. Detaching an entire armored division to liberate Paris would create a gap in the line, divert precious fuel and ammunition from exploitation operations, and commit First Army to supporting a city of 2 million people whose needs would consume resources desperately needed elsewhere. Hodges told Leclerc the answer was no. Within 24 hours, that answer would be overruled by political necessity that made military logic irrelevant. The uprising inside Paris had begun as spontaneous resistance rather than coordinated military operation. French resistance cells, sensing German weakness after weeks of Allied advances, decided to seize key buildings and infrastructure before Germans could destroy them during withdrawal. On August 18th, resistance fighters occupied the Prefecture of Police, several government ministry buildings, and began erecting barricades in major thoroughfares. The German garrison commander, General Dietrich von Choltitz, commanded approximately 20,000 troops, a mix of infantry, security forces, and administrative personnel, to control a city of 2 million increasingly hostile inhabitants. Choltitz faced contradictory orders from higher command. Hitler had personally ordered Paris destroyed rather than surrendered intact, directing demolition of bridges, monuments, and industrial facilities. But Choltitz, a career officer who'd witnessed the futility of Nazi Germany's military position, was reluctant to destroy one of Europe's cultural treasures in a pointless gesture. He negotiated a temporary ceasefire with resistance leaders, ostensibly to prevent civilian casualties, but actually to buy time for Allies to arrive and relieve him of having to choose between obeying Hitler's destruction order and preserving the city. The ceasefire was fragile and wouldn't hold indefinitely. If Allies didn't intervene soon, fighting would resume and Paris would be devastated. On August 22nd, Eisenhower personally intervened in the Paris question after receiving urgent appeals from French General Pierre Koenig, commander of French forces of the interior, and from political leaders of the Free French government in exile. Eisenhower contacted Bradley at 12th Army Group headquarters and authorized immediate liberation of Paris, overriding previous plans to bypass the city. Bradley passed the order to Hodges: detach French 2nd Armored Division and U.S. 4th Infantry Division, send them to Paris, secure the city as quickly as possible with minimal destruction. Hodges objected strenuously in a conversation recorded in First Army operations logs. Paris will consume 4,000 tons of supplies per day. We're already running short of fuel. This will stop 7 Corps cold, just as we're achieving breakthrough. Request permission to continue exploitation and liberate Paris later, when logistics permit. Bradley's response was sympathetic but final. Political decision has been made at highest level. We liberate Paris now, regardless of military cost. Issue the orders. Hodges complied, but his operations staff diary entry for August 22nd captured his frustration. Forced to divert 2 divisions to Paris for political reasons. Operational exploitation sacrificed for propaganda victory. Germans escaping ahead of 7 Corps because we lack forces to pursue. History will remember Paris liberation. History won't record opportunity cost. The advance to Paris began on August 23rd, with French 2nd Armored Division in the lead, followed by 4th Infantry Division as supporting the force. Leclerc's division moved rapidly through suburbs, encountering sporadic German resistance but no coordinated defense. German forces inside Paris were more concerned with withdrawal than fighting. Von Choltitz had already decided to ignore Hitler's destruction orders and was preparing to surrender the city intact, though he couldn't communicate this publicly without being arrested for treason. On August 24th, lead elements of French 2nd Armored reached Paris city limits and began entering through southern districts. The scene was chaotic euphoria. Parisians poured into streets, surrounding tanks, climbing aboard vehicles, offering wine and flowers to soldiers. French troops, many of whom hadn't seen Paris since 1940 when France fell, wept openly at returning to their capital. American soldiers of the 4th Infantry Division, entering Paris from the west, received similarly rapturous welcomes. For propaganda purposes, the liberation was perfect. For military purposes, it was beginning of a logistics nightmare. V Corps Commander Major General Leonard Jarrow, whose corps included the 4th Infantry Division, found himself responsible for securing a major European capital with minimal preparation and inadequate resources. Paris required immediate governance, civil authority had to be reestablished, public services restored, food distribution organized, and approximately 50,000 German prisoners processed and secured. Jarrow had none of the specialized civil affairs units necessary for these tasks. He improvised, assigning engineer battalions to restore electricity and water service, quartermaster companies to organize food distribution, and military police battalions to maintain order. The work consumed thousands of soldiers who should have been supporting combat operations. Meanwhile, Paris's population celebrated liberation with such enthusiasm that movement through the city became nearly impossible. Major thoroughfares were blocked by celebrating crowds. Vehicles couldn't proceed without literally pushing through masses of people. Supply convoys that needed to pass through Paris en route to forward areas got trapped for hours in traffic jams. One convoy commander's after-action report, written in evident frustration, noted, "Paris liberation, most joyful day in French history. Complete disaster for American logistics. Took 18 hours to traverse city that should require 2 hours. Recommend all future supply convoys route around Paris, regardless of additional distance." August 26th brought the symbolic culmination of Paris liberation, with General Charles de Gaulle's triumphant march down the Champs-Élysées. Over 1 million Parisians lined the route as de Gaulle, accompanied by Leclerc and other French commanders, walked from the Arc de Triomphe to Notre Dame Cathedral. Snipers, likely German holdouts or French collaborators, fired intermittently during the procession, creating brief panic but causing few casualties. De Gaulle refused to take cover, maintaining dignified composure throughout the march, to demonstrate French sovereignty restored. For French national morale, the march was essential symbolism. For First Army operations officers watching combat units diverted to provide security for parades, while German forces escaped eastward, the symbolism was costly pageantry. American commanders weren't invited to participate in the central ceremonies. This was deliberately staged as French liberation of French capital, with American forces as supporting cast. The political messaging was clear. France had liberated itself with Allied assistance, not been liberated by allies. The historical narrative was being written in real time through careful stage management of who appeared where during celebrations. The supply burden of Paris became apparent within days. The city's population needed food, having suffered shortages during German occupation. Power plants required coal to generate electricity. Water treatment facilities needed chemicals and equipment. Hospitals needed medical supplies. Transportation systems needed fuel and spare parts. All of these needs fell on Allied logistics systems already strained to breaking point. First Army received orders to divert supply tonnage to Paris, reducing available supplies for combat operations. On August 28th, V Corps reported it was rationing ammunition because supply convoys destined for corps units had been redirected to Paris civil support. Artillery battalions received instructions to limit fire missions to conserve shells. Tank units were told to minimize movement to preserve fuel. These restrictions directly impacted combat effectiveness, at the moment when First Army was supposed to be exploiting success and maintaining pressure on retreating Germans. The operational cost of Paris liberation was being paid by frontline combat units receiving reduced support, so civilians in a liberated city could eat. The trade-off was politically necessary, but militarily frustrating. German forces used the Paris pause effectively. 7th Army, shattered during the Falaise encirclement and subsequent retreat, gained 6 days to establish defensive positions along the Seine River, east of Paris, and begin organizing coherent defensive lines. Units that had been retreating in disorder used the pause to regroup, absorb stragglers, and redistribute equipment salvaged from destroyed formations. German logistics benefited from shortening supply lines as they withdrew toward Germany, while Allied lines stretched longer. When First Army resumed full offensive operations on August 31st, German resistance was noticeably more organized than during the chaotic pursuit of mid-August. Intelligence estimates suggested the Paris pause had allowed Germans to save perhaps 30,000 to 40,000 soldiers, who might otherwise have been captured or forced to surrender due to isolation. Those soldiers would man defensive positions. First Army would face in September and October. The pause had given Germany a gift of time it shouldn't have received. Political necessity had overridden military advantage. First Army casualties during the Paris operation were relatively light, approximately 800 killed and wounded between August 23rd and August 26th. But the opportunity cost was substantial. While 2 divisions secured Paris, 7th Corps' exploitation toward Chartres and Reims had to pause because removing 2 divisions created gaps that adjacent units had to cover by spreading thinner. The pause allowed German forces ahead of Wolfswitz Corps to withdraw unmolested. Post-war analysis by Army historians estimated that continued exploitation without the Paris detour might have trapped an additional German corps, roughly 30,000 soldiers, that instead escaped to fight again. The analysis concluded liberation of Paris was political necessity that carried significant operational cost. First Army lost momentum at critical moment of exploitation. German forces gained time to reorganize defenses. Campaign timeline extended by estimated 2 to 4 weeks due to Paris pause. 2 to 4 weeks of additional combat operations meant thousands of additional casualties. The lives saved in Paris by preventing its destruction were paid for by lives lost elsewhere when the campaign extended longer than militarily necessary. These trades were never acknowledged publicly. They were simply the hidden arithmetic of wartime leadership. On August 31st, as First Army prepared to resume offensive operations, Hodges issued orders to corps commanders that revealed his strategic assessment. V Corps would advance northeast toward Belgium and the approaches to Germany. 7th Corps would drive east toward the German border. 99th Corps would maintain pressure on German forces withdrawing from northern France. The objectives were ambitious. Hodges wanted First Army to reach the Siegfried Line, Germany's western border fortifications, before German defenders could fully man them. Speed was essential, but speed required supplies. First Army didn't have, after 6 days focused on Paris. Fuel stocks were adequate for perhaps 3 days of mobile operations. Ammunition reserves were thin. Vehicle maintenance had been deferred, while resources went to Paris support. The Army resuming offensive operations on August 31st was logistically weaker than the Army that had paused operations on August 25th. Paris had been liberated. France was grateful. De Gaulle had his triumph. And First Army faced the German border with inadequate supplies, worn equipment, and the certain knowledge that harder fighting lay ahead. The Invisible Army had delivered another victory that would be credited to others. The cost of that victory would be borne by soldiers whose names would never appear in history celebrating Paris's liberation. Courtney Hodges understood this and considered it acceptable if the machine kept functioning. The test of whether the machine could endure months of sustained operations was about to begin. Germany awaited, and Germany would not fall as easily as France had been liberated. August 6, 1944, 2200 hours. In the Norman town of Mortagne, France, men of the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment, 30th Infantry Division were settling into defensive positions for the night. The battalion, approximately 700 soldiers, occupied Hill 314, a rocky prominence that dominated the surrounding countryside and provided observation over roads leading west toward Avranches. the critical junction through which all American supplies flowed from Normandy into the Breakout area. The men had been fighting continuously since D-Day and were grateful for a relatively quiet sector after weeks of hedgerow combat. Most soldiers were digging foxholes, heating rations, writing letters home, the routine of soldiers in a quiet sector. Then, at 22:15 hours, German artillery began falling on American positions throughout the Mortagne area. Not harassing fire, not registration rounds, full bombardment from multiple batteries, concentrating on American command posts and road junctions. Within minutes, radio reports flooded into First Army headquarters from units along a 20-mile front. Massive German attack developing, armor and infantry, attacking westward toward Avranches. Hitler had ordered Germany's last major offensive in France, and 2nd Battalion on Hill 314 stood directly in its path. Operation Lüttich, the German codename, was Adolf Hitler's personal response to the Cobra breakthrough and subsequent American exploitation. Rather than conducting orderly withdrawal to more defensible positions, Hitler ordered immediate counterattack to cut American supply lines at Avranches, isolate Patton's Third Army, which had exploited south into Brittany, and restore German defensive coherence in Normandy. The plan required concentrating Germany's remaining armored strength in France, 4 panzer divisions totaling approximately 180 tanks and assault guns, for a narrow thrust of 30 miles through American positions to reach the coast. If successful, Lüttich would split Allied forces, trap Third Army without supplies, and force Americans to fight 2 separate campaigns in France instead of one coordinated advance. If it failed, Germany would have wasted its strategic reserve on offensive that had no chance of changing the war's ultimate outcome. Hitler, increasingly detached from military reality and convinced that willpower could overcome material disadvantage, insisted the attack proceed despite field commanders' concerns. The attack began after dark to minimize American air superiority, with German forces achieving tactical surprise against American units that hadn't expected major offensive operations. The German forces executing Lüttich were elite but exhausted formations. 2nd Panzer Division, 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, and 116th Panzer Division, names that carried weight in German military hierarchy, had been fighting continuously for weeks and were significantly under strength. 2nd Panzer had roughly 70 tanks operational instead of authorized 120. 1st SS Panzer had 60 tanks instead of 100. Total German armored strength was perhaps 180 vehicles, not the 300 Hitler's plan assumed, but these were experienced crews and well-maintained Mark IV and Panther tanks. Attacking at night against American infantry divisions that had limited anti-tank capabilities and no armor support immediately available, the initial penetration was dramatic. German armor overwhelmed forward American positions, drove 7 miles westward during the night, and by dawn on August 7th had advanced further in 6 hours than any German attack in France had achieved since June. The situation looked catastrophic on maps at First Army headquarters. German spearheads were within striking distance of cutting the Allied supply line. If they reached Avranches, the entire Cobra exploitation would collapse. 2nd Battalion on Hill 314 became isolated immediately when German armor bypassed their position during the night advance. The Germans couldn't afford to stop and reduce a fortified position. Their mission required speed to reach Avranches before American reinforcements arrived. So German columns simply drove past Hill 314, leaving the American battalion surrounded, but still occupying terrain that dominated German supply routes. Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Eads Hardaway radioed to regiment that his position was cut off, but defensible. He had approximately 700 men, adequate ammunition for several days, limited food and water, and excellent observation of German movement. Hardaway requested immediate artillery support on German columns visible from the hill. First Army artillery, already responding to the crisis, began firing pre-planned concentrations on roads around Mortagne. The shells began landing within minutes. 2nd Battalion adjusted fire by radio, walking artillery impacts onto German supply vehicles and assembly areas. The isolated battalion had become an artillery observation post behind German lines, directing devastating fire onto an offensive that depended on continuous supply flow. The morning of August 7th brought First Army's response to the crisis. Hodges, receiving initial reports around midnight on August 6th-7th, immediately grasped the situation's seriousness. German penetration toward Avranches threatened the entire Normandy lodgment, but Hodges also recognized an opportunity. German armor attacking westward was moving away from defensive positions and into terrain where American air power could engage them in open country during daylight, rather than immediately committing reserves to contain the penetration. Hodges ordered his operations staff to coordinate with 9 Tactical Air Command for maximum air support at first light. Brigadier General Elwood Quesada, commanding 9 TAC, promised to commit his entire available force, over 200 fighter bombers, to attacking German armor around Mortain. The plan was aggressive: use air power to destroy German offensive capability, rather than using ground forces to contain it. If successful, Luttich would be defeated by coordinated air-ground response that demonstrated how far First Army's combined arms coordination had evolved since D-Day. If unsuccessful, German forces might reach Avranches and trigger operational crisis. August 7th dawned clear, perfect flying weather after weeks of clouds and rain. 9. Tactical Air Command launched maximum effort against German forces around Mortain. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, each armed with rockets and 500-pound bombs, attacked in waves throughout the day. The Thunderbolt, with its heavy armor and powerful radial engine, was particularly effective against tanks. Pilots made low-level attack runs, firing rockets at German vehicles from ranges where tank machine guns could shoot back. The combat was intimate and deadly. Pilots could see German tank commanders trying to button hatches as aircraft approached. They could watch rockets impact tank turrets and see crews bail out burning. German anti-aircraft fire was intense. Flak 38 guns firing 20mm shells that could destroy aircraft with single hits. 9 TAC lost 26 aircraft on August 7th, but flew 492 sorties, individual attack missions, dropping over 470 tons of ordnance on German forces in an 8-hour period. The effect was devastating. German commanders reported that movement became impossible during daylight. Vehicles that moved were destroyed within minutes. The offensive, which required mobility to succeed, was paralyzed. On Hill 314, 2nd Battalion endured 6 days of isolation, while directing artillery and observing German dispositions. The siege became legendary in 30th Division history. German forces couldn't dislodge the Americans without diverting forces from the main attack, but couldn't ignore them because the battalion's observation enabled devastating artillery fire. Germans shelled the hill continuously. They probed defenses with infantry attacks that were repulsed with heavy casualties. They tried bypassing the position entirely, but found that American artillery destroyed any concentration near the hill that radio observers could see. Water became a critical issue. The hill had no natural water sources, and temperatures in early August exceeded 80 degrees. Wounded men suffered particularly without adequate water for medical treatment. By August 10th, the battalion had exhausted all water supplies. Men were drinking from puddles formed by recent rain. Medical supplies were gone. Ammunition was running low. Radio messages to regiment became increasingly desperate. Need water, medical supplies, ammunition, can hold if resupplied. Without resupply, position untenable within 24 hours. But ground supply was impossible. German forces surrounded the hill. Air supply by parachute was attempted, but largely failed due to German anti-aircraft fire and difficulty accurately dropping supplies onto the small hilltop. The German offensive collapsed on August 12th, after 6 days of sustained effort. Luftwaffe failure to achieve even temporary air superiority meant German armor remained vulnerable to air attack during all daylight hours. American artillery, directed by observers like those on Hill 314, destroyed German supply vehicles faster than Germany could replace them, and German casualties from combined air and artillery attack exceeded reinforcement rates. By August 11th, German commanders were reporting to higher headquarters that continuing the offensive was pointless. They were losing tanks and men without any prospect of reaching Avranches. Hitler, characteristically, ordered the attack continue regardless of casualties. Field commanders, equally characteristically, prepared to withdraw despite orders. On August 12th, German forces began pulling back from Mortain toward defensive positions farther east. The offensive had failed catastrophically. Germany had committed its strategic reserve to attack that achieved nothing except destroying scarce armored forces that couldn't be replaced. The failure demonstrated that, by August 1944, German military capability had degraded to the point where offensive operations against prepared American positions were suicide regardless of tactical skill or individual courage. Relief of 2nd Battalion on Hill 314 came on August 12th when 30th Division Infantry finally broke through German encirclement. Of the 700 men who had held the hill on August 6th, 370 remained combat effective. The rest were dead, wounded, evacuated due to dehydration, or too physically exhausted to fight. The survivors were gaunt, dehydrated, many suffering from infected wounds that hadn't been properly treated. They had held their position for 6 days against repeated German attacks while surrounded, short of water, out of medical supplies, and running low on ammunition. Their observation and artillery direction had been crucial to defeating Luttich, but their sacrifice illustrated the human cost of the kind of defensive operations First Army would increasingly need to conduct as German resistance stiffened. The survivors were evacuated to rear areas for medical treatment and rest. Most would return to combat within weeks. Some would die in subsequent battles. All would carry psychological scars from 6 days of isolation under fire. Their story would be told in 30th Division history, but largely ignored in broader narratives of the campaign that focused on offensive operations and exploitation rather than defensive stands. First Army's defeat of Luttich demonstrated the maturity of its combined arms system. Air-ground coordination that had been experimental in July was now routine in August. Artillery fire direction had become so efficient that forward observers could call fire missions and have shells landing within 5 minutes. Infantry armor cooperation had evolved to the point where isolated infantry battalions could hold against armored attacks because they knew supporting fires would arrive. The system Hodges had built worked even when individual components were isolated or under extreme pressure, but Luttich also revealed continuing vulnerabilities. German forces had achieved tactical surprise despite First Army having excellent intelligence networks. American divisions held defensive sectors too wide to prevent penetrations, and the casualty cost of stopping German attacks was high. First Army suffered approximately 3,000 casualties during the 6 days around Mortain, most in units that bore the brunt of German assault. These casualties were in addition to ongoing losses from continuing exploitation operations elsewhere along the front. The cumulative effect was divisions growing progressively weaker even as they advanced deeper into France. By mid-August, many First Army divisions were operating at 60 to 70% of authorized strength. Replacement flows weren't keeping pace with casualties. The machine was wearing out even as it demonstrated growing effectiveness. The question was whether it could sustain operations long enough to reach Germany before exhaustion forced operational pause. The answer would come in the autumn, when First Army faced the most difficult fighting of the entire campaign, the approach to the Siegfried Line and the horror of the Hürtgen Forest. Mortain was preview of the kind of desperate German resistance that would characterize that fighting. The killing was far from over. September 12, 1944. Captain Paul Bosch, commanding Company G, 18th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, stood in light rain at the edge of a forest near Rhine, Germany, staring at what his maps identified as the West Wall, the Siegfried Line. After 98 days of continuous combat from Omaha Beach to the German border, First Army had reached the fortification line Germany had built in the 1930s to defend against French invasion. The Siegfried Line wasn't a single wall, but rather a defensive zone up to 3 miles deep, consisting of thousands of reinforced concrete bunkers called pillboxes, anti-tank obstacles called Dragon's Teeth, rows of truncated concrete pyramids designed to stop armored vehicles, and extensive minefields covering approaches. Boche had fought through Norman hedgerows, pursued Germans across France, and survived the Mortain counterattack. None of it had prepared him for what he was seeing. The dragon's teeth stretched across the landscape in geometric patterns, each concrete pyramid 4 feet high, and positioned to create impassable barriers for tanks. Behind them, barely visible through rain and autumn mist, were the pillboxes, low concrete structures with firing ports designed to provide interlocking fields of fire across every approach. This wasn't field fortifications that could be bypassed. This was permanent fortification that would have to be reduced piece by piece. Boche turned to his executive officer and said quietly, "We're going back to World War I. Assault on prepared defenses. This is going to cost everything." The operational situation facing First Army in September 1944 was dramatically different from the exploitation warfare of August. The pursuit from Normandy had covered over 300 miles in 4 weeks, but that success had created new problems. First Army now held a front of approximately 150 miles, stretching from Belgium through Luxembourg to the German border. Roughly twice the width doctrine suggested a single field army could effectively control. The rapid advance had outrun supply lines to the point where combat operations had to pause repeatedly while logistics caught up. Divisions that had been at 80% strength in June were now at 60% after 3 months of continuous casualties, and German forces, shattered during the summer retreat, were beginning to reconstitute behind fixed fortifications on their own territory, where supply lines were short and reserve troops available. The campaign was transitioning from exploitation to assault on prepared defenses, precisely the kind of fighting that favored defenders and cost attackers heavily in casualties. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges faced impossible force-to-space ratios. Military doctrine in 1944 suggested that infantry division could effectively defend a front of roughly 10 miles if properly supported. First Army in September had 8 divisions, 3 armored and 5 infantry, to hold 150 miles, giving an average of nearly 19 miles per division. Some sectors were held more strongly where attacks were planned, which meant other sectors were held proportionally thinner. The Ardennes sector, along the German-Belgian-Luxembourg border, where forested terrain made offensive operations difficult, was held by just 4 divisions covering 80 miles, 20 miles per division. This thin deployment was calculated risk. Hodges assessed that German forces lacked strength for major offensive operations, and that the Ardennes' rough terrain would channel any attack into predictable routes where it could be contained. The calculation was based on reasonable intelligence estimates of German capabilities in September. It would prove catastrophically wrong in December, but the seeds of the Battle of the Bulge were being planted in the force distribution decisions Hodges made in September, based on having too few troops to hold too much front. The first major urban battle for a German city began on October 2nd, when 7th Corps attacked Aachen, a city of 160,000 inhabitants just inside Germany. Aachen held symbolic and practical importance. Symbolically, it was Charlemagne's capital in the 8th century, and represented the historical heart of Germanic identity. Practically, it sat astride critical road networks that First Army needed for further advance. German defenders, told they were defending German soil for the first time, fought with fanatical intensity that shocked American attackers accustomed to Germans withdrawing when surrounded. The battle became house-to-house combat through destroyed neighborhoods. American tactics relied on massive artillery bombardment to pulverize buildings, then infantry assault with tank support to clear survivors. Each city block required similar treatment. Progress measured in buildings per day rather than miles. German defenders used the city's medieval architecture, stone buildings, cellars, narrow streets, to maximum advantage. They'd position machine guns in cellars with firing ports at ground level, making them nearly impossible to spot until Americans were in kill zones. They'd booby-trap buildings so that when Americans entered, explosives buried in walls would detonate. They'd conduct counterattacks at night, infiltrating through sewers to attack American positions from unexpected directions. The civilian population of Aachen complicated operations enormously. Despite German evacuation orders, tens of thousands of civilians remained in the city when fighting began. American artillery and airstrikes killed indiscriminately. The weapons couldn't distinguish combatant from non-combatant in urban terrain, where everyone was behind stone walls. Civilian casualties numbered in thousands. American soldiers, trained to view Germans as enemies, struggled with moral complexity of fighting in cities where elderly, women, and children were caught in the combat. Some units took pains to minimize civilian harm, establishing safe corridors and delaying attacks on buildings known to shelter civilians. Others, hardened by months of combat and losing friends to German defenders hiding among civilians, showed less restraint. The experience of urban combat in Aachen would shape American attitudes towards subsequent city fighting. It revealed that urban warfare was among the most casualty-intensive forms of combat, costly for attackers and devastating for civilian populations. Aachen fell on October 21st after 19 days of continuous fighting. American casualties exceeded 5,000. German casualties, military and civilian combined, exceeded 12,000. The first German city had been captured at enormous cost. Dozens more lay ahead on the road to Berlin. While the 7th Corps fought for Aachen, V Corps began operations in the Hürtgen Forest, a 50-square-mile area of dense woodland southeast of Aachen that dominated approaches to the Ruhr River. The Ruhr, seemingly insignificant, 50 yards wide, easily bridged, became strategic objective because Germans controlled dams at its headwaters. If Americans crossed the Ruhr and advanced east, Germans could open the dams and flood the river valley, trapping American forces on the east bank without supplies or reinforcements. First Army needed to capture the dams before crossing the Ruhr, which meant attacking through the Hürtgen Forest, where German forces had prepared extensive defenses. The forest fighting that began in mid-September would continue through December, ultimately becoming one of the most controversial and costly operations First Army conducted during the entire war. The Hürtgen represented everything that could go wrong when attacking prepared defenses in terrain that negated American advantages. The Hürtgen Forest was defenders' paradise and attackers' nightmare. The forest consisted of mature fir trees planted in neat rows, creating canopies so dense that aerial observation was impossible, and artillery tree bursts multiplied casualties by showering infantry with wood splinters and shrapnel. The terrain was steep ridgelines separated by draws, with few roads and extensive German minefields covering every approach. Visibility was measured in yards. Mechanized warfare became impossible. Tanks couldn't maneuver through trees and became targets for German anti-tank guns positioned to fire down forest trails. American advantages in artillery and air power were largely negated because forward observers couldn't see targets through the forest canopy, and pilots couldn't identify targets from the air. What remained was close-range infantry combat under conditions that favored defenders who'd had weeks to prepare positions. German forces had cut fields of fire through trees, constructed log bunkers reinforced with earth and concrete, and positioned machine guns to create interlocking fire across every clearing. American infantry attacking through the Hürtgen advanced into pre-registered kill zones where German defenders enjoyed every advantage except numbers. The casualties in the Hürtgen were horrific and disproportionate to ground gained. The 28th Infantry Division, entering the forest in early November, suffered over 6,000 casualties in 10 days to advance less than 3 miles. Entire rifle companies ceased to exist as combat units. Battalion commanders, normally positioned well behind front lines, were killed at rates unprecedented in American military history because the forest compressed command distances, requiring leaders to move forward to maintain contact with scattered units. The psychological impact of Hürtgen fighting exceeded physical casualties. Men developed thousand-yard stare after days of close combat where death came suddenly from invisible enemies and artillery tree bursts that killed randomly regardless of whether soldiers were in foxholes. Cases of combat exhaustion, the World War II term for what later generations would call PTSD, spiked dramatically. Soldiers reached psychological breaking points where they could no longer function in combat but showed no physical wounds. The causes were obvious: continuous artillery bombardment in confined space, constant casualties among unit members creating survivor guilt, inability to see enemy creating paranoia, and awareness that the fighting was essentially static, with minimal territorial gains to justify the losses. By December 1st, First Army had suffered approximately 33,000 casualties in the Hürtgen Forest, fighting, killed, wounded, evacuated for combat exhaustion, and missing, to advance roughly 8 miles and capture approximately 50 square miles of woodland. The casualty density was among the highest of any American operation in World War II, 660 casualties per square mile captured. For comparison, the Normandy campaign from D-Day through August averaged roughly 40 casualties per square mile. The disparity revealed how attacking prepared defenses in unfavorable terrain could negate every advantage attackers possessed. Post-war analysis by military historians questioned whether the Hürtgen operation was necessary at all. Alternative approaches, bypassing the forest, isolating it, or accepting that Americans couldn't cross the Ruhr until spring, might have achieved strategic objectives without the staggering casualties. But in autumn 1944, with political pressure to maintain offensive momentum and end the war before winter, pausing operations wasn't acceptable to higher command. First Army was ordered to attack, and Hodges executed those orders despite growing awareness that his divisions were being bled white for limited gains. The Ghost Front, the quiet sector in the Ardennes, held by just 4 divisions covering 80 miles, was the calculated risk that made offensive operations in the Hürtgen and at Aachen possible. Hodges and his staff assessed that the Ardennes terrain made large-scale offensive operations unlikely, and that German forces lacked resources for attacks, while simultaneously defending against Allied offensives elsewhere. Intelligence estimates throughout autumn 1944 consistently reported German forces conducting defensive operations, pulling back to conserve strength and showing no signs of offensive preparations. These estimates were generally accurate. Germany was conducting strategic defense. What intelligence failed to detect was Hitler's decision in early November to mass forces for one final offensive gamble in the West, attacking through precisely the quiet Ardennes sector where American defenses were thinnest. The intelligence failure wasn't due to lack of effort or incompetence. It resulted from Germany's exceptional operational security, deliberate deception measures, and Allied assumption that Germany was too weak for major offensive operations. The assumption was reasonable based on available information. It was also catastrophically wrong. On December 13th, First Army Intelligence Section, the G2, issued its regular weekly intelligence summary. The summary assessed German capabilities and intentions based on prisoner interrogations, radio intercepts, aerial reconnaissance, and agent reports. The summary's key conclusion, in language that would become infamous, enemy incapable of major offensive action in current circumstances. Defensive posture maintained along entire front. Limited local counterattacks possible, but no indication of forces sufficient for operational level offensive. The assessment was professionally reasoned, supported by evidence, and completely incorrect. 3 days later, on December 16th, over 200,000 German soldiers, supported by 1,400 tanks and assault guns, would attack through the Ardennes in the largest German offensive in the West since 1940. The intelligence failure that allowed complete operational surprise wasn't unique to First Army. SHAEF intelligence and British intelligence made identical assessments, but First Army would bear the immediate consequences. The Ghost Front was about to explode, and Courtney Hodges, commanding an army already exhausted by 3 months of attritional fighting, would face the greatest crisis of his career, one that would nearly destroy him personally and threaten to collapse First Army's entire position. The killing in the Hürtgen had been terrible. The killing about to begin in the Ardennes would be worse. And First Army, stretched thin and worn down by continuous operations, was about to learn that defensive fighting against surprise attack was far more deadly than offensive operations against prepared defenses. The machine Hodges had built was about to face its ultimate test. Whether it would survive that test remained an open question on December 15th, 1944, as soldiers on the Ghost Front settled into routine positions, unaware that tomorrow would bring the nightmare. December 16th, 1944, 05:30 hours. Private First Class Lyle Boak, leading a reconnaissance platoon of the 99th Infantry Division, woke to a sound he'd never heard before, a rolling thunder that seemed to come from everywhere at once. His platoon, 18 men total, occupied positions near Lanzerath, Belgium, a tiny village on the German-Belgian border in the Ardennes Forest. The sound was German artillery, hundreds of guns firing simultaneously along an 80-mile front. Buck grabbed his radio and tried to contact battalion headquarters. Static. He tried regiment, more static. All communications were dead, cut by German artillery that had precisely targeted American wire lines and radio relay stations in the opening bombardment. Buck ordered his men to defensive positions and waited, listening to the artillery creep closer. At 0600 hours, searchlights suddenly illuminated the pre-dawn darkness. German forces using anti-aircraft searchlights bounced off low clouds to create artificial daylight for their advancing infantry. Through the eerie artificial dawn, Buck saw what looked like ghosts emerging from the forest, hundreds of German soldiers in white winter camouflage moving toward American positions. Behind them, barely visible, were tanks. Buck realized with sick certainty that something catastrophic was happening. This wasn't a local raid. This was an army attacking, and nobody in American command had seen it coming. The German assault, later named the Battle of the Bulge for the westward bulge it would create in Allied lines, began with overwhelming force concentrated on the weakest sector of First Army's front. Operation Wacht am Rhine, Hitler's code name, committed 3 German armies totaling over 250,000 soldiers, 1,400 tanks and assault guns, and nearly 2,000 artillery pieces to an offensive aimed at splitting Allied forces by driving to Antwerp, the port through which most Allied supplies flowed. The plan was strategically delusional. Germany lacked fuel, air cover, and reserves necessary for such an ambitious operation, but tactically sound. German forces achieved complete surprise by attacking through the Ardennes, exactly where American defenses were thinnest, during winter weather that grounded Allied aircraft and limited observation. The assault hit 4 American divisions: 99th Infantry Division, 106th Infantry Division, 28th Infantry Division, and 4th Infantry Division, all under First Army command, all holding frontages 2 to 3 times wider than doctrine recommended. Within hours, the German penetration was tearing gaps in American defenses that couldn't be immediately closed. At First Army headquarters in Spa, Belgium, a resort town 15 miles behind what had been a quiet front, Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges received the first coherent reports around 0700 hours. The messages were fragmentary and confusing, multiple divisions reporting heavy attacks, communications disrupted across wide front, German armor penetrating in several sectors, civilian refugees streaming west, reporting German tanks on roads that should have been well behind American lines. Hodges immediately contacted 12th Army Group Commander Omar Bradley to report the situation, but neither man initially grasped the scale of the attack. German offensive operations had been so rare in recent months that both commanders' first assessment was that this was a spoiling attack, limited offensive designed to disrupt Allied preparations for future operations. Hodges ordered V Corps and 8 Corps, which held the attack sectors, to contain penetrations and prepare counterattacks with local reserves. It was reasonable response based on available information. It was also inadequate for the actual situation developing. By 0800 hours, the scope of the disaster was becoming clearer. The 106th Infantry Division, positioned along the Schnee-Eifel Ridge in Germany, reported that German forces had penetrated on both flanks, threatening to encircle the division's forward regiments. 2 entire regiments, the 422nd and 423rd Infantry, roughly 8,000 men, were being surrounded before they could withdraw. Division Commander Major General Alan Jones requested permission to pull his forward units back to defensible positions. The request went through corps to Army group, consuming precious hours while German forces tightened the encirclement. When permission finally came, it was too late. Both regiments were cut off, completely surrounded, and would surrender within days in the largest mass surrender of American forces in the European theater. 8,000 soldiers lost before First Army even understood what was happening. The communications breakdown paralyzed First Army's response during the critical first 12 hours. German artillery had systematically destroyed phone lines. Radio communications were disrupted by atmospheric conditions, German jamming, and the simple chaos of units moving rapidly under fire. First Army headquarters lost contact with entire divisions for hours at a time, relying on fragmentary reports from rear area units and civilian refugees for information about frontline situations. The fog of war, always present in combat, became impenetrable. Hodges and his operations staff worked from maps that were hours out of date, showing unit positions that no longer existed and defensive lines that had already been breached. Staff officers tried to compile coherent picture from contradictory reports. One division reported repelling attacks. The adjacent division reported German tanks in their rear areas. Both couldn't be accurate, which was wrong. Without communications, there was no way to determine truth from confusion. Decision-making became paralyzed by uncertainty about basic facts of the situation. At 1200 hours, 6.5 hours into the offensive, Hodges made his first major decision, order V Corps Commander General Gero to commit Corps reserves to contain the penetrations. V Corps had 2 divisions in reserve, the 2nd Infantry Division and 9th Infantry Division. Committing them would stop German advance in V Corps sector, but would exhaust First Army's immediate reserves north of the breakthrough. If Germans penetrated elsewhere, there would be no forces available to contain them. Hodges accepted the risk, calculating that stopping the northern penetration was essential, even if it meant accepting vulnerability elsewhere. The decision revealed Hodges' command style under pressure, methodical, focused on immediate tactical problems rather than strategic implications, trusting subordinate commanders to execute while he maintained overall coordination. Under normal circumstances, this approach worked well. Under circumstances of massive surprise attack with communications disrupted and reserves inadequate, it meant First Army responded to the crisis in piecemeal fashion, addressing immediate threats without grasping that the entire position might be untenable. By 1700 hours, 11.5 hours into the offensive, the scale of German penetration was undeniable. German forces had achieved breakthrough in multiple sectors, penetrating up to 20 miles in some areas. The critical road junction at Saint-Vite was threatened from 3 directions. Bastogne, another key crossroads town, was in German sights. American units were fighting desperately, but conducting fighting withdrawal rather than holding positions. Refugees, American soldiers, Belgian civilians, scattered vehicles were streaming westward, bringing reports that German armor was everywhere. Hodges faced the decision he'd hoped to avoid: whether to evacuate First Army headquarters from Spa. The town was just 15 miles from the front, well within range of German penetration if they maintained current rate of advance. V Corps Commander General Gero, whose headquarters was even closer to the breakthrough, called Hodges requesting permission to withdraw his command post. Hodges authorized the withdrawal, then he faced his own situation: stay in Spa and risk capture if Germans broke through, or evacuate and send signal to the entire army that command was losing confidence. At 1900 hours, Hodges ordered First Army headquarters to evacuate Spa and displace to Chaude-Fontaine, approximately 40 miles west. The order triggered controversy that would follow Hodges for the rest of his career. No other American Army headquarters in Europe evacuated under enemy pressure during World War II. The withdrawal was prudent given the proximity of German forces and the vulnerability of headquarters with its thousands of staff officers and tons of sensitive documents. But it looked like panic. Worse, the evacuation consumed critical hours when staff should have been coordinating defensive operations, loading vehicles, moving equipment, establishing communications at new location. All of this took time during which First Army was essentially out of action as functioning command entity. Subordinate units, already struggling with communications problems, found themselves without effective higher headquarters for 8 to 10 hours during the night of December 16th-17th. Corps commanders made decisions independently, often contradicting each other because there was no Army-level coordination. The German penetration, serious but potentially containable on December 16th, became catastrophic on December 17th, partly because First Army headquarters was in transit rather than functioning. The psychological impact on Hodges of the 16th's events was severe and immediate. The general who'd built his reputation on methodical planning and thorough preparation had been caught completely by surprise. Intelligence had failed, defensive positions had collapsed, communications had broken down, reserves were inadequate, and German forces were achieving the kind of dramatic penetration that ended military careers and destroyed armies. According to staff officers present, Hodges became increasingly withdrawn as the day progressed, sitting silently at maps while subordinates provided updates, responding to questions with brief instructions rather than his usual detailed guidance. His chief of staff, Major General William Keane, effectively began running First Army operations, issuing orders in Hodges' name, while the commanding general processed the catastrophe unfolding. This wasn't incompetence or cowardice. It was the beginning of psychological breakdown in a commander facing the worst crisis of his career after months of continuous strain. The machine Hodges had built so carefully was coming apart, and the man who'd built it was beginning to crack under the pressure. By 2100 hours, 15.5 hours into the offensive, First Army had compiled enough information to understand the strategic situation. 3 German armies were attacking along 80-mile front. Estimated German strength was over 100,000 soldiers, probably significantly more. Penetrations had reached 15 to 20 miles in multiple sectors. American divisions in contact were suffering heavy casualties and conducting fighting withdrawal rather than holding positions. The road network behind the front was clogged with retreating units and refugees, making reinforcement difficult. Allied air forces were grounded by weather, eliminating the air superiority advantage that had defeated previous German offensives. First Army's position was critical and potentially catastrophic. Hodges radioed Bradley at 12th Army Group. Situation extremely serious, multiple German penetrations, forward divisions heavily engaged, corps reserves committed, Army reserves inadequate, request immediate reinforcement, and recommend consideration of strategic withdrawal to more defensible line. It was as close as Hodges had ever come to admitting defeat. The message reached Bradley at his headquarters in Luxembourg City at 2200 hours. Bradley, still not fully grasping the crisis, responded that reinforcements would be dispatched, but that First Army must hold present positions without major withdrawals. Maintaining continuous front was essential. First Army would receive help, but must not collapse. The 16th ended with First Army in the worst position any American field army had faced since Kasserine Pass in Tunisia 2 years earlier. 8,000 soldiers surrendered at Schnee-Eifel. Thousands more were casualties or missing. German forces had achieved penetration that threatened entire American position in the Ardennes. Communications remained disrupted. Headquarters was in transit. Reserves were committed. And the commanding general was showing signs of psychological crisis that his staff was working desperately to conceal. The Invisible Army, which had fought from Normandy to the German border with professional competence, if not public recognition, was suddenly facing potential destruction. The next week would determine whether First Army could recover from catastrophic surprise and contain the German offensive, or whether it would be split apart and destroyed piecemeal. The outcome depended on decisions made under extreme pressure by commanders operating with fragmentary information and inadequate resources. And it depended on whether Courtney Hodges, the accidental general who'd built the Invisible Army through sheer professional competence, could hold himself together long enough to lead his army through its darkest hour. December 16th had been 16 hours of chaos. The chaos was just beginning. December 17th, 1944. 0. 300 hours. In a commandeered hotel in Chaudfontaine, Belgium, Major General William Keane, Chief of Staff of First Army, found Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges sitting alone in an office staring at a map of the Ardennes. The map showed German penetrations marked in red, ugly arrows driving westward through American positions like daggers. Keane had come to brief Hodges on the night's developments and coordinate next day's operations. But when he entered the office, Hodges didn't acknowledge his presence. Keane spoke. "General, we have updated situation reports from V Corps and the 8 Corps." Hodges continued staring at the map. No response. Keane tried again. Sir, General Jarrow requests guidance on whether to commit 2nd Infantry Division immediately or hold it in reserve. Still no response. Keane approached closer and realized Hodges wasn't studying the map. He was simply staring, his eyes unfocused, his expression blank. Keane had seen this before in rifle company commanders who'd been in combat too long, the 1,000-yard stare that indicated psychological breaking point. But this wasn't a captain commanding 190 men. This was the commanding general of 400,000 soldiers, and the general was shutting down at the moment when his army faced potential destruction. Keane quietly left the office, gathered senior staff officers, and made a decision that would determine First Army's fate. They would run the army themselves until Hodges recovered. No one outside the inner staff could know the commanding general was incapacitated. The fiction of command continuity had to be maintained while they fought the battle themselves. The psychological collapse of Courtney Hodges during the Battle of the Bulge's first week remained classified for over 40 years, not officially acknowledged until declassification of First Army medical records in the 1980s. The official narrative presented Hodges as competently directing defensive operations from headquarters while corps commanders executed tactical details. The reality, documented in staff diaries and medical notes from First Army's surgeon, was darker. Hodges suffered what his personal physician, Colonel Paul Sauer, described as acute exhaustion bordering on nervous breakdown between December the 17th and December 23rd. The symptoms were classic combat fatigue, insomnia, inability to concentrate, withdrawal from decision-making, episodes of unresponsiveness, and what Sauer termed catastrophic thinking, where Hodges verbally expressed certainty that First Army would be destroyed and the war lost. For 6 days, while First Army fought the most critical defensive battle in its history, the commanding general was psychologically unable to command. His staff ran the army in his name, issuing orders they believed Hodges would have given if capable, while desperately concealing his condition from subordinate commands and higher headquarters. The medical context helps explain why Hodges broke. He'd been in continuous command responsibility since February 1944, 10 months without a break. He'd overseen D-Day planning and execution, the Bocage fighting, Operation Cobra, the pursuit across France, the approach to Germany, and 3 months of brutal attritional combat in the Hürtgen Forest. The Hürtgen fighting particularly had worn on him. He'd watched divisions destroyed for minimal gains, questioned whether the operation was necessary, but executed orders from higher command to maintain offensive pressure. The cumulative stress of command decisions that cost thousands of lives, combined with physical exhaustion from 18-hour workdays 7 days a week, had degraded his psychological resilience. The shock of December 16th surprise attack, the intelligence failure, the rapid collapse of forward positions, the communications breakdown, triggered complete psychological shutdown in a man who depleted all reserves of emotional endurance. Modern understanding of combat stress and PTSD recognizes that leadership positions carry psychological burdens that accumulate over time, and that commanders can reach breaking points just as frontline soldiers can. In 1944, such understanding barely existed. Commanders were expected to function indefinitely under any stress level. When they couldn't, the failure was character flaw rather than psychological injury. Chief of Staff William Keane became de facto First Army commander between December 17th and December 23rd. Keane, 50 years old, was career infantry officer who'd served as Hodges' Chief of Staff since First Army's activation. He knew Hodges' command style intimately and understood the operational situation thoroughly, but he lacked authority to make strategic decisions in his own name. The solution was to operate through what amounted to benign conspiracy. Keane would consult with senior staff officers, operations, intelligence, logistics, and reach consensus on necessary actions. He'd then brief Hodges during his more lucid moments, present decisions as recommendations, and obtain Hodges' formal approval. If Hodges was unresponsive, Keane would issue orders anyway, signing them as Chief of Staff but implying they came from the commanding general. Corps commanders received instructions they believed came from Hodges, but which actually represented staff collective judgment. The system worked because First Army's Corps commanders were experienced, and because the defensive situation required less active command intervention than offensive operations would have. Units were fighting for survival and needed minimal guidance beyond general direction to hold key terrain. But the fiction was fragile. If higher command discovered that First Army's general was incapacitated, Hodges would be relieved, and Keane likely court-martialed for concealing command disability. The staff managed to conceal Hodges' condition from 12th Army Group through careful management of communications. When Bradley called or visited, staff ensured Hodges was present for meetings, but minimized his verbal participation. Briefings were structured so staff officers presented information, while Hodges nodded approval. Written communications were drafted by staff and presented to Hodges for signature during periods when he was functional enough to sign documents. The deception wasn't perfect. Bradley's aide noted in his diary on December 19th that Hodges seemed unusually quiet and withdrawn during a headquarters visit, but Bradley attributed this to stress of the defensive battle rather than psychological breakdown. Bradley himself was under enormous pressure from Eisenhower to contain the German offensive and had limited attention to spare for subordinate commanders' mental states. As long as First Army continued fighting effectively, Bradley didn't probe too deeply into how decisions were being made. The medical treatment Hodges received was primitive by modern standards. Dr. Sauer prescribed sedatives to help Hodges sleep. He'd been awake for over 48 hours during the initial crisis, and recommended complete rest for at least a week. Complete rest was impossible. Compromise was reached. Hodges would maintain minimal public schedule while staff ran operations. On December 20th, Sauer noted in medical records, patient showing signs of severe exhaustion. Recommend immediate relief from command duties for medical treatment. However, patient refuses evacuation and insists on remaining with Army. Have prescribed sedatives for sleep and recommended reduced schedule. Prognosis uncertain. If stress continues, complete breakdown likely. The note captured the impossible situation. Hodges couldn't be evacuated without revealing his condition and triggering relief from command. But remaining in command while psychologically compromised risked both his health and his Army's effectiveness. The only option was to maintain fiction of command while hoping Hodges recovered before the deception collapsed or the military situation deteriorated beyond staff's ability to manage. December the 21st brought the psychological crisis to its peak. German forces achieved deepest penetration of the offensive, reaching within 4 miles of the Meuse River, the last major obstacle before open country leading to Antwerp. American defensive positions at Bastogne and Saint-Vit were surrounded but holding. The weather remained overcast, preventing Allied air operations. Fuel shortages were beginning to slow German advance, but American positions were still critical. At a morning staff meeting, Hodges verbally expressed opinion that First Army should withdraw to the Meuse River immediately, abandoning all positions east of the river and conceding half of Belgium to German occupation. This was catastrophic thinking divorced from military reality. Such withdrawal would expose Patton's Third Army flank and potentially trigger operational collapse across the entire front. Keane and the operations staff quietly ignored the statement, continuing to issue orders for defense in place. After the meeting, Keane confronted Hodges privately. "Sir, you need rest. The staff can manage operations for a few days. Please get some sleep and let us handle the tactical situation." According to Keane's post-war memoir, Hodges responded, "I've failed. The Army's been surprised and beaten. They should relieve me." Keane's response was blunt. "They'll relieve you if you don't get control of yourself. The Germans are being stopped. The line is holding. Your Army is doing what it was trained to do, but you need to sleep or you're going to collapse completely." The intervention worked, possibly because it was framed as protecting Hodges' career rather than protecting the Army. On December 21st evening, Hodges accepted sedation and slept for 14 hours, his first sustained sleep since December 15th. When he woke on December 22nd, staff officers noted marked improvement. He was alert, asking detailed questions about current situations, providing actual guidance rather than just signing off on staff recommendations. The crisis wasn't over. Hodges would remain psychologically fragile for weeks, but the acute breakdown phase was ending. By December 23rd, Hodges was functional enough to attend conferences with Bradley and to provide genuine command direction to corps commanders. The staff conspiracy could begin to wind down. Orders could once again actually come from the commanding general, rather than staff operating in his name. First Army had survived 6 days of fighting with an incapacitated commander through the professionalism of its staff and the robustness of the command system Hodges himself had built. The system had proven capable of functioning even when the man who created it couldn't. It was both testament to effective organization and indictment of a military culture that drove commanders to psychological destruction while denying that such breakdowns could occur. The long-term impact of the breakdown on Hodges was complex. He never fully regained the confidence and assurance he'd shown before December 16th. Staff officers noted he became more deferential to subordinates' judgment, less willing to make unilateral decisions, more anxious about potential surprises. Some interpreted this as improved leadership, better delegation, and listening to subordinate expertise. Others saw it as psychological damage that reduced his effectiveness. What's undeniable is that Hodges never again showed the independent confidence he'd displayed during the Normandy campaign. The invisible general had nearly become the broken general. That he recovered and led First Army through final victory testified to his fundamental strength of character. But the cost was permanent psychological scarring from 6 days when the weight of command exceeded human capacity to bear it. Modern armies recognize that commanders need rest, rotation, and psychological support. World War II armies expected generals to function indefinitely under any stress until they died or won. Courtney Hodges nearly died psychologically. That he survived was due less to military medicine than to loyal staff who covered for him, and to the machine he'd built, continuing to function when its builder couldn't. The invisible army had fought invisibly even from its own commander, and it had held. The question now was whether it could do more than hold, whether it could counterattack and destroy the German offensive that had nearly destroyed it. December 24th, 1944. The weather over Belgium cleared for the first time in 9 days. American soldiers in defensive positions around Bastogne, Saint-Vith, and along the shoulders of the German penetration looked up to see what they'd been desperately waiting for: blue sky. Within hours, the sky filled with aircraft. Hundreds of C-47 transport planes dropped supplies to surrounded American forces. Swarms of P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs attacked German columns struggling through snow-choked roads. Medium bombers struck German supply depots and fuel dumps. The Allied air forces, grounded since December 16th by cloud cover and winter storms, returned with devastating effect. For German forces that had advanced 40 miles in 8 days, living off captured American supplies because their own logistics couldn't keep pace, the weather change was catastrophic. American air power had been the decisive factor in defeating every previous German offensive. Now it returned at the moment when German forces were most vulnerable, extended far from bases, short of fuel, and exposed in open terrain. The Battle of the Bulge's outcome was being decided not by ground combat, but by clear skies and American industrial capacity to put thousands of aircraft over the battlefield simultaneously. First Army, which had spent 8 days fighting desperate defensive battle, was about to transition to counteroffensive. The question was whether units exhausted by defense could immediately shift to attack. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, recovered enough to resume active command, met with his corps commanders on December 24th to coordinate counteroffensive operations. The plan was straightforward. 7th Corps under General Collins would attack south from defensive positions north of the German penetration, driving toward Houffalize where it would link with Patton's 3rd Army, attacking north from Luxembourg. The link-up would cut the German salient in half, trapping German forces in the western portion of the penetration and forcing their surrender or retreat. Simple in concept, but difficult in execution. 7th Corps would be attacking through the same broken terrain, narrow roads, and winter weather that had slowed German advance. German forces, though weakening, were still dangerous and would defend desperately to keep escape routes open. And 7 Corps divisions had been fighting defensive battles for 8 days. They were understrength, short of supplies, and psychologically exhausted. Asking them to immediately transition to offensive operations was demanding but necessary. The window of opportunity to trap German forces was measured in days. Delay would allow Germans to withdraw before being encircled. The counteroffensive that began on December 26th revealed how much First Army had evolved since Normandy. The methodical, step-by-step advance that had characterized hedgerow fighting was gone, replaced by aggressive exploitation that accepted risk to maintain tempo. 7. Corps attacked with 3 divisions abreast: 2nd Armored Division, 3rd Armored Division, and 84th Infantry Division, coordinated to maintain continuous pressure rather than pausing to consolidate gains. Forward air controllers traveling with lead battalions directed airstrikes against German positions within minutes of request. Artillery fired time-on-target missions that dropped hundreds of rounds simultaneously on German strongpoints. Tank infantry teams bypassed German resistance where possible and reduced it with overwhelming firepower where necessary. The operations demonstrated combined arms competence that First Army had purchased with 6 months of continuous combat and 30,000 casualties. The machine Hodges had built was functioning at peak efficiency despite, or perhaps because of, the crisis it had survived. Units knew what to do without detailed orders. Coordination happened through trained procedures rather than micromanagement. The system worked. German resistance varied from fanatical to token, depending on units encountered. Elite formations like 1st SS Panzer Division fought desperately, conducting skillful delaying actions that cost American forces casualties for every mile gained. Volksgrenadier divisions, hastily raised infantry units with minimal training and poor equipment, surrendered readily when surrounded or attacked with overwhelming force. The variation meant American advance rates were unpredictable. Some days saw gains of 5 to 7 miles. Other days saw brutal combat for single villages that cost hundreds of casualties. The weather remained brutally cold, temperatures well below freezing, snow cover measuring several feet in places, roads alternating between ice and mud, depending on time of day. Soldiers fought not just Germans, but also frostbite, trench foot from wet boots and frozen foxholes, and simple exhaustion from operating in conditions that drained physical energy faster than rest, and food could replace it. Medical evacuations for cold weather injuries approached combat casualty rates in some units. The Battle of the Bulge was being won, but at continuing human cost that would scar units and individuals for the remainder of the campaign. On January 1st, 1945, Germany launched Operation Nordwind, a secondary offensive in Alsace designed to draw Allied forces away from the Ardennes. The attack hit American and French forces in northeastern France, achieving tactical surprise similar to the initial Bulge offensive. Eisenhower and Bradley faced strategic dilemma. Should First Army divert forces to contain Nordwind, or should it maintain focus on closing the Bulge salient regardless of what happened elsewhere? The decision revealed how command relationships had evolved. Before the Bulge, Eisenhower might have ordered First Army to send divisions to Alsace. After the Bulge, he trusted Hodges and Bradley to maintain operational focus despite pressure elsewhere. First Army kept attacking toward Houffalize. 6th Army Group, commanded by General Jacob Devers, contained Nordwind with available forces and limited American withdrawal. The decision accepted risk in Alsace to maintain momentum in the Ardennes. It worked because German forces lacked resources to exploit opportunities in multiple locations simultaneously. But it was a calculated gamble that might have failed if German capabilities had been stronger. The link-up between First Army and Third Army occurred on January 16th, when lead elements of 7th Corps met Patton's forces at Houffalize. The meeting was less dramatic than planners hoped. Houffalize was destroyed rubble rather than intact town, and German forces had already withdrawn from the western salient rather than waiting to be encircled. But the link-up restored continuous Allied front and marked psychological turning point. The German offensive had failed. American forces had absorbed the surprise attack, stopped the penetration short of operational objectives, and counterattacked successfully to restore the front. The cost was staggering. First Army suffered approximately 46,000 casualties between December 16th and January 16th, including 8,000 killed. Equipment losses were similarly severe. Over 300 tanks destroyed or captured, hundreds of vehicles lost, artillery pieces abandoned when positions were overrun. But German losses exceeded American losses by significant margins. Over 100,000 German casualties, over 600 tanks destroyed, and critically fuel and ammunition expended that Germany couldn't replace. The Battle of the Bulge destroyed Germany's strategic reserve in the West. After January 1945, German forces in Western Europe would conduct only defensive operations. The initiative permanently passed to Allies. By January 28th, First Army had returned to pre-Bulge positions along the German border and was preparing to resume offensive operations toward the Rhine River. The month-long defensive battle and counteroffensive had delayed Allied advance by roughly 6 weeks, but hadn't fundamentally altered the strategic situation. Germany remained surrounded, outproduced, and incapable of replacing losses. The Bulge had been Hitler's gamble that tactical surprise could achieve strategic reversal. The gamble failed because American forces at tactical level, company and battalion commanders, sergeants, individual soldiers, fought effectively despite surprise and confusion. First Army had held, not because Hodges made brilliant command decisions during the crisis. He'd been incapacitated, but because the army he'd built was resilient enough to function without constant command intervention. The decentralized execution, thorough training, and robust systems that characterized First Army throughout the campaign proved their value when the army was tested under worst possible conditions. The human cost of the Bulge extended beyond casualty statistics. Divisions that had entered the Ardennes in mid-December emerged in late January as fundamentally different organizations. The 99th Infantry Division, which had been in combat less than 2 weeks when the offensive began, suffered over 30% casualties and lost most of its experienced junior leaders. The rebuilt division in January was composed largely of replacements who'd never served together before. Unit cohesion, the intangible quality that makes military organizations effective, had to be rebuilt from scratch. Similar patterns repeated across First Army. The 2nd Infantry Division, the 28th Infantry Division, the 4th Infantry Division, all had been hollowed out by Bulge casualties and refilled with replacements. These were still effective military units, but they weren't the same units that had fought from Normandy to Germany. The institutional knowledge, shared experience, and collective competence that develops in organizations that fight together had been diluted by massive personnel turnover. First Army in February 1945 was stronger on paper than First Army in June 1944. More divisions, more equipment, better supply situation. But it was weaker in ways that didn't appear in strength reports. For Courtney Hodges personally, surviving the Bulge crisis provided psychological rehabilitation, even as it left permanent scars. He'd faced his worst moment as a commander and survived. His army had been surprised, battered, and nearly broken, but it had held and then counterattacked successfully. The recovery of command function after his breakdown gave him renewed confidence that was different from his pre-Bulge assurance. Before December, Hodges had been confident in his planning and systems. After January, he was confident that his systems could survive even when he personally couldn't maintain control. It was humbler confidence, chastened by having experienced psychological limits, but also more resilient because it wasn't dependent on his personal infallibility. The staff conspiracy that had covered for him during his breakdown created unspoken bond between Hodges and senior staff officers. They'd saved his career and possibly his life. He knew it. They knew he knew it. Nothing was ever formally acknowledged, but the relationship changed from commander-subordinate to something closer to partnership. First Army's final months of operations would benefit from that partnership, as Hodges showed increased willingness to defer to staff expertise and corps commanders' judgment. The Invisible Army had fought the Battle of the Bulge invisibly even to Supreme Headquarters in certain respects. While public attention focused on Bastogne and Patton's rescue of surrounded forces, a narrative Patton actively promoted, First Army had held the shoulders of the German penetration, prevented the breakthrough from expanding north or south, and provided half the forces for the counteroffensive that closed the salient. But public narrative emphasized Third Army's role while minimizing First Army's contribution. The The pattern established in Normandy repeated in the Ardennes. First Army did essential work while other forces received public credit. Hodges accepted this with his characteristic stoicism. His concern was operational effectiveness, not historical recognition. The machine had been tested under catastrophic conditions and proven functional. That was sufficient. The recognition could go to whoever wanted it. Germany remained to be defeated. The Rhine had to be crossed. The war had to be won. First Army would do its part without requiring acknowledgement. The invisible army would remain invisible by choice and design. What mattered was victory, not credit. And victory, finally, was within reach. February 23, 1945. Engineers of the 5th Armored Division, 1st Army, crouched at the western bank of the Ruhr River near Jülich, Germany, preparing to launch assault boats into water, swollen by upstream dam releases. German forces, retreating from the Ruhr, had opened the Schwammenauel and Urft dams 2 weeks earlier, flooding the river valley and delaying American crossing. The flooding had finally receded enough for assault operations. Across the river, approximately 300 yards distant, German positions were barely visible through early morning mist. Artillery preparation had pounded German defenses for 30 minutes, but everyone knew crossing rivers under fire was among the most dangerous operations in warfare. Boats would be vulnerable during the crossing. Men climbing out onto the far bank would be exposed. Casualties would be heavy. But the Ruhr was the last major water obstacle before the Rhine, and the Rhine was the last major obstacle before interior Germany. 300 miles of German territory lay between the Ruhr and the Elbe River, where Allied forces would meet advancing Soviet armies. The race for Germany was beginning. And despite public attention on Montgomery's elaborate Rhine crossing preparations, scheduled for late March, First Army would cross first through aggressive exploitation of any opportunity. The doctrine of maintaining relentless pressure regardless of obstacles, paid for in blood since Normandy, was about to deliver strategic payoff. The final offensive into Germany occurred in a context of political complexity that influenced military operations in ways that would only become fully clear decades later. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had agreed on occupation zones for defeated Germany. Soviet forces would occupy eastern Germany. American, British, and French forces would occupy western Germany. Berlin, though deep inside the Soviet zone, would be divided among all four powers. The agreement meant that regardless of where Allied forces were when Germany surrendered, they'd have to withdraw to agreed occupation boundaries. This created perverse incentive. Advancing beyond occupation zones cost lives but gained nothing permanent because forces would withdraw afterward anyway. Eisenhower, aware of the political agreements, began making operational decisions based on minimizing casualties rather than maximizing territory captured. This would lead to his controversial decision in April to halt Allied advances and allow Soviet forces to capture Berlin. But in February, when these decisions hadn't yet been made, First Army was still pushing east as rapidly as German resistance and logistics allowed. The Ruhr crossing on February 23rd succeeded despite significant casualties. Initial assault waves crossed under artillery cover and established small bridgeheads on the east bank. Engineers followed immediately, constructing Bailey bridges, prefabricated steel structures that could be assembled rapidly under fire to allow tanks and heavy equipment to cross. Within 36 hours, First Army had 3 divisions across the Ruhr and was advancing toward the Rhine. German resistance, though still determined in places, lacked the coordination and strength of previous defenses. Germany's military capacity was collapsing under pressure from multiple directions. Soviet forces advancing from the east, British and Canadian forces in the north, American forces in the center and south. German units were surrendering or retreating rather than defending to destruction. The Wehrmacht that had fought so effectively in the Hürtgen Forest just months earlier was disintegrating under the sustained pressure that First Army and its allies had maintained, despite Germany's best efforts to halt or reverse Allied advance. March 7, 1945, brought the operational miracle that would shorten the European war by weeks: the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. The bridge, a railroad span across the Rhine near the town of Remagen, should have been destroyed by German engineers before American forces arrived. Every other bridge across the Rhine had been blown by retreating Germans to delay Allied advance. But at Remagen, a combination of German command confusion, faulty demolitions, and incredibly brave action by American soldiers resulted in the bridge being captured intact. Elements of the 9th Armored Division, First Army, reached the bridge on the afternoon of March 7th. German engineers attempted to demolish it as Americans approached. The explosives detonated but failed to collapse the bridge. Charges had been incorrectly positioned or were insufficient for the bridge's heavy construction. American infantry charged across under fire, cutting demolition wires and securing the far side. By nightfall, First Army had a bridgehead across the Rhine, the only intact crossing of Western Europe's last major river barrier. The strategic implications were enormous. Hodges recognized immediately the importance of the Remagen Bridge and committed First Army's available reserves to exploiting the bridgehead before German forces could organize effective response. Third Corps, which controlled the sector where Remagen was located, received orders to push maximum forces across the bridge regardless of casualties or supply constraints. Within 48 hours, First Army had moved over 8,000 soldiers across the Rhine at Remagen. Within a week, the bridgehead expanded to include over 25,000 soldiers and 300 tanks. German forces attempted to destroy the bridge through artillery fire, air attack, and even frogmen swimming downriver with explosives. American engineers worked continuously to repair bomb damage and reinforce the weakened structure. On March 17th, 10 days after its capture, the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed from accumulated damage and overuse, killing 28 American engineers who were working on it. But by then, First Army engineers had constructed multiple pontoon bridges adjacent to the original crossing, making the bridge's loss irrelevant. The bridgehead was secure and expanding. The political reaction to Remagen revealed the tensions between American and British command. Montgomery had been planning a massive set-piece Rhine crossing, Operation Plunder, scheduled for late March with extensive artillery preparation, air support, and airborne assault. The operation was designed to be strategically decisive and would restore British prestige after the Bulge embarrassment, when Eisenhower had placed British forces temporarily under American command. First Army's accidental capture of Remagen Bridge preempted Plunder's significance. American forces were across the Rhine 2 weeks before Montgomery's carefully prepared operation. Churchill, in communications with Roosevelt, downplayed Remagen's importance while emphasizing that Plunder would be the decisive Rhine crossing. The British press followed this line, treating Remagen as fortunate accident while Plunder was presented as brilliant planning. American press, particularly those embedded with First Army, recognized the slight and began pushing back. For the first time in the campaign, First Army received sustained positive press coverage as reporters emphasized that American forces had achieved, through aggressive exploitation, what Montgomery required weeks of preparation to accomplish. The invisible army was briefly becoming visible, though the visibility would prove temporary. Eisenhower's decision on Berlin, made in late March, effectively ended the race for Germany before First Army could join it. On March 28th, Eisenhower cabled Soviet leader Stalin directly, informing him that Allied forces would halt at the Elbe River rather than advancing to Berlin. Eisenhower's rationale was sound from casualty minimization perspective. Berlin would cost enormous casualties to capture and would be in Soviet occupation zone anyway per Yalta agreements. But the decision infuriated Churchill, who wanted Western forces to capture as much German territory as possible to strengthen post-war negotiating position with Stalin. Bradley and Hodges, presented with the halt order, reluctantly complied, but continued pushing east until actually reaching the Elbe. First Army units reached the river near Magdeburg on April 11th, approximately 69 miles from Berlin. American reconnaissance units crossed the Elbe and probed toward Berlin before being ordered back. Had Eisenhower chosen differently, First Army might have entered Berlin before Soviet forces. The choice not to race for Berlin was political rather than military, made for sound reasons regarding American casualties. But it meant that First Army's final advance ended not with dramatic capture of enemy capital, but with halt at arbitrary river line. The Ruhr encirclement, completed in early April when First Army and Ninth Army linked up near Lippstadt, trapped over 325,000 German soldiers, the largest mass surrender in the Western Front. The encirclement demonstrated First Army's operational sophistication. Rather than directly attacking the Ruhr industrial region, heavily fortified and urbanized terrain that would have cost enormous casualties, First Army bypassed it to the south, while Ninth Army bypassed to the north. The two armies linked in the German rear, surrounding the entire Ruhr garrison. Trapped German forces, commanded by Field Marshal Walter Model, attempted breakout, but were contained by American forces that had learned from Falaise and other encirclement battles how to maintain perimeter integrity. Model, recognizing the situation was hopeless, ordered his forces to surrender on April 18th. He then committed suicide rather than face capture. The Ruhr Pocket eliminated Army Group B as fighting force and removed the last significant German military formation in Western Germany capable of organized resistance. Between the Elbe halt in mid-April and German surrender on May 7th, First Army transitioned from combat operations to occupation duties. Units swept through German territory, accepting surrender of scattered Wehrmacht forces, securing displaced persons camps, and establishing military government in occupied areas. The discoveries of concentration camps, Buchenwald, Nordhausen, and others in First Army's sector exposed the Holocaust's horrors to soldiers who'd been fighting Germans for nearly a year without fully understanding the Nazi regime's criminal nature. Soldier reactions varied from shock to rage. Some units forced German civilians from nearby towns to tour the camps and bury the dead, attempting to make local populations confront what they had tolerated or supported. Other units simply documented the camps for war crimes investigations and moved on, emotionally numb after months of combat violence. The camp liberations would become central to post-war narratives about why the war was fought, but for soldiers encountering them in April and May 1945, they were simply another horror in a campaign that had been filled with horrors from beginning to end. May 7, 1945, brought German unconditional surrender. First Army received orders to cease offensive operations and consolidate positions. The war in Europe was over. First Army had fought for 11 months of continuous operations, 336 days from D-Day to VEE Day without operational pause. It had advanced over 800 miles from Omaha Beach to the Elbe River. It had liberated portions of France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and conquered Western Germany. It had captured or killed hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, and it had suffered approximately 190,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing, and captured, representing roughly 45% of all American ground combat casualties in the European theater. These numbers made First Army statistically the most important American ground force in the European campaign. Yet, in the victory celebrations, First Army remained largely invisible. News coverage focused on Patton and Third Army, Montgomery and British forces, Eisenhower, and Show-Off. Hodges and First Army received perfunctory mention in most accounts. The Invisible Army remained invisible even in victory. For the soldiers of First Army, VE Day brought relief rather than celebration. Most units remained in Germany, knowing they'd likely redeploy to the Pacific for the invasion of Japan. The war wasn't over, just the European portion of it. Letters home from May and June 1945 reflect this reality. Soldiers expressed gratitude at surviving Europe, but resignation about Pacific deployment. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, and Japan's subsequent surrender, came as unexpected reprieve. Most First Army soldiers would return home rather than invade Japan. But the psychological scars of 11 months of combat operations came home with them. Post-war studies of First Army veterans showed higher rates of what we now call PTSD than average American combat veterans, reflection of the sustained combat exposure and high casualty rates the Army had endured. The Invisible Army's casualties weren't just the dead and wounded, but also the psychologically damaged who would carry their experiences through decades of civilian life. The full cost of First Army's campaign couldn't be calculated in casualty reports. It could only be measured in damaged lives and families shaped by trauma that veterans couldn't articulate and civilian society wasn't prepared to address.